August 15, 2016 ATB. Shinjuku Ghetto, Tokyo Settlement. 0430. Before my eyes had snapped fully open in the early morning darkness, I was already on my feet, pistol in hand and my thumb on the safety. From across the narrow studio room, one of the 3 cheap cell phones lined up on Ogi's old cot buzzed again. Its diode flashed a bright red. Relaxing marginally, thumb creeping away from the safety, I crawled to the bed, looked down, and resisted the urge to spin up my enhancement suite. I did not need magic for everything, certainly not for just examining the contents of my own room. Besides, just the thought of using magic made something deep in my chest ache with fatigue. Let's see. It's not Diethard's phone. Not Naoto and Ogi's phone. I swallowed hard as the 3rd phone lit up once again. I had only given one person the number for that particular burner phone. Kagaya. What cookies did I serve when we first met? I demanded of the faintly buzzing line, phone tucked up against my ear. My pistol was still firmly in hand, just in case. Chocolate chip cookies. The voice on the other end replied in a familiar Kyoto Ben. The cheap good kind. Relaxing, I put the pistol down on Ogi's cot and sank back down onto Naoto's. Chocolate chip could have been anybody's guess, but only somebody with the atrocious sense of taste that appeared to characterize the nobility of all societies would have deemed the cookies I had served at that meeting good. "Hello, Lady Kagaya," I greeted in Japanese, putting some warmth into my voice, trying not to sound like I had just been forced awake by the call. "How may I help you this morning?" "Ah." Kagaya breathed, the line going silent for a minute. I heard slow, breezy sounds, inhales and exhales. Trying to calm herself down, I guessed. She's nervous. Brace for the worst. "So," Kagaya began again, speaking at last, just as I was starting to wonder if she had gone to sleep. "Remember how, when you said revere the Emperor at our first meeting, I said that was probably me?" "Yes," I replied without hesitation, remembering exactly how that flippant response had provoked immediate consternation. "I do remember you saying something along those lines." "Well." More breathing. "Well. That's changed. Two can play this game," I thought, hands clenching on each other as I took in a deep breath. "I need to be awake for this." "Tanya?" Kagaya asked, her voice worried. "Did you just groan? Are you all right?" "Fine, Lady Kagaya. Just fine," I replied shortly, unclenching my teeth as directed mana flowed through my brain, stimulating me to full, forced wakefulness. "What has changed, if I may be so bold as to inquire?" "My coronation was 2 days ago," she replied unhappily. "So, probably doesn't really apply anymore." "I see," I said, speaking slowly as my mind blurred. "We have an empress now? What does that matter? We aren't even a sovereign country anymore." "No," I told myself, taking hold of my racing thoughts and pushing away the clamor. "Think. Why does it matter? Are you Japanese, or are you 11? Deep breaths. 1, 2, 3. Why did it matter? Think. We don't just need men and material to win this war, we need morale. We need symbols to rally our spirit behind. Symbols like the old office of the emperor. An office abolished by the old oligarchs who founded the defunct republic. The oligarchs who failed us. The oligarchs are gone now, or will be soon. And now we have a monarch once again." "Your Imperial Majesty," I said, scrambling to remember lessons long, long ago, in the childhood of a life 2 deaths removed from the present. "May your rule last forever." "Please don't," came the unhappy reply. "Not from you. And not before you hear why I called." And now the hammer falls, I thought, absurdly calm as something under my breastbone screamed in panic and pain. "We have an emperor. No, an empress. The sun is truly rising. Rising far too early." "I take it that this is not a social call, then," I replied, striving for equanimity. "I can't say I thought it was." "It is not," Kagaya confirmed, and took another breath. When she spoke again, her voice was resolute. I call upon you to fulfill the deal we struck. Loyal service for loyal support. Our deal stands, I affirmed, my tongue heavy in my mouth. Around me, I could feel Shinjuku like a smothering blanket, enfolding me in the arms of hundreds and thousands. Your food has fed thousands, your weapons have armed hundreds, your medicine has kept us healthy. What are you asking for, Your Majesty? There is no escape. To steal a line, the Pebbles have voted for an attack on Britannia, Kaguya said, her own voice rich with stress and, behind its superficial brightness, clotted with despair. They even voted for their own figurehead in yours truly. I tried to discourage them, believe me. I tried to convince them that it was all too rash, but, she sighed again. But, in the end, I guess I was just a girl before I was an empress. I had that problem too, I replied, and winced as I heard the snap in my own voice. But, I continued, more conciliatory, I suppose having a line of rifles pointed at their heads will make even the most thick-skulled old greybeard change their mind. I suppose so, Kaguya hushed a laugh. I could have perhaps used a few of those. But that water has gone well past the bridge now. You have called in your marker to demand that I join in this mass suicide. It was a statement, not a question. Already, I could see the howitzers lifting their long black arms up into the sky. Yes. Kaguya admitted, and no, and no? Suddenly, my heart was in my mouth. Had she found some way out of this trap, this countrywide trap? Damn you, I cursed the girl, remembering dancing green eyes flecked with gold. How dare you inflict hope upon me, you vicious bitch? It turns out that becoming an empress, even a puppet empress, comes with some benefits. Rank has its privileges, as you might say, Kaguya said with a dry little chuckle. Not very many, certainly not as many as I might claim were I to have an actual crown or control over even a single plot of truly sovereign land, but a bit. Enough to make some alterations to the original plan. Alterations that will require some of those rifles you mentioned earlier, and trustworthy soldiers to wield them. Tell me what you need, I demanded, trying to keep the desperation from my voice. And doing my best to ignore the suspicion that the meat I was biting at concealed a truly massive barb. What is the plan? What are your orders? The rising will happen, Kaguya affirmed, a coordinated strike at settlements, military bases, and Britannian enclaves great and small across the country. That much is out of my hands to stop. But in the first hours of the rising, before anybody in the administration truly understands the scope and the organization involved in our effort, a special unit will enter the Fuji mining complex, concealed within trucks with Samaragi Industries livery. This unit will consist of a squad picked from the JLF's Nightmare Corps, along with as many of your best as you can give me. This unit, Kaguya bleakly continued, no enthusiasm in her voice, will first take control of the mining complex, allowing the remainder of Colonel Todo's command to enter the complex. Next, they will plant explosive charges at a number of key locations throughout the mine according to the direction of my experts. Finally, they will hold the complex against any attempt by Britannian forces to retake the mines. And should all else fail, every officer and sergeant of the unit will have the detonation codes for the charges. The detonation of even one will be sufficient to initiate a chain of sympathetic explosions throughout the length and breadth of the saccharidite veins that make up the Fuji lode. And here we are again, staring into the jaws of a suicide pact, just like the old men. I could see the bleak humor in it, though I wouldn't be laughing. Only 3 days ago, I had made myself a dictator out of the sincere desire to maintain all that I had built, despite efforts from within to overturn all that I had labored towards on a single throw of the dice. But unlike Nishizumi, Kaguya has proven herself a reliable partner. Which means diplomacy might have a chance, and then what? I asked, breaking the pause that had grown tumor-like across the line's dead air. If all goes according to plan, you will have put, at the very least, the entirety of the home islands into a massive hostage situation. I assume you have some ideas for the negotiations to follow? I have a few, Kaguya acknowledged, with a sort of giggling snort utterly lacking in humor. While I'd love to just insist that the Britannians leave, I don't think that will happen for a whole range of options. Instead, I think the best achievable solution would be a sort of return to the pre-war arrangement, where we pay Britannia to stay away with our Saccharidite. It has merit, I grudgingly admitted. Leaving aside the Britannian hunger for conquest, the only thing they really need from us is our Saccharidite. But what is it that we really need? We would effectively be purchasing protectorate status from the Britannians in place of direct rule. We still would not be free, as we would forever labor under the hanging sword of Britannia, always keenly aware that, should the exports stop, the Britannians would return. And when the rest of the world languishes under the Britannian heel, conquered by war machines powered by Japanese Saccharidite, what then? And besides, a darker, less reasoning voice added up, what about the shattered cities and squandered lives? The destruction and theft of cultural treasures, the devastation of infrastructure, and the enslavement and export of tens of thousands? What about the callous cruelty, all of our dead sent to landfills with the trash? Where in a peace purchased with our scarce remaining natural resources can we find our revenge? And even that fragile bridge towards peace was founded on the assumption that the Britannians would allow such an affront as an area overthrowing its overlords. Would their pride let them give up the mines? Even if they still exact their tribute, the loss would doubtless stick in their craws. Their supreme yet glass-jawed superiority could force their hands and prompt another attack, an effort to call the Craven 11 bluff, and then we'd be forced in turn to make good on our threat. And let the world burn. I have a suggestion, I said, breaking the renewed conversational pause. Will you hear me out? Absolutely, Kagaya immediately replied. You're the one who knows about this kind of thing, after all. I am? Whatever gave her that impression? A threat only has teeth so long as the willingness to execute exists, I began, laying the first bricks of my argument on a bed of conventional wisdom. I am not convinced that men and women fighting for the safety of their families and the freedom of their home would be willing to push the button destroying everything that they love when the moment comes. I am not questioning their bravery nor their dedication, mind, I am simply stating that, when the cost of something you love is everything else that you hold dear, hesitation is only to be expected. All of which can just as well be applied to you or, indeed, to me, I reflected, alone in my dark room save for the phone's weak light. If push comes to shove, Kagaya, would you be willing to kill our entire nation in a final act of spite? Would I? But if she'll listen. We can find somebody, Kagaya said, grimly certain. There is no shortage of people without any families left, after all. Certainly, I agreed, and do you want any of those people to wield life and death over your head? The answer was obvious, so I didn't bother waiting for it. Instead, consider this, we do not need to destroy the Saccharidite, we simply need to render it unusable for the Britannians. True, Kagaya admitted, mulling the idea over. But anything short of destroying the Saccharidite veins only means that the Britannians lose access to the lode for a limited period. Assuming we lose, of course. Which we would, given unlimited time and no other constraints on the Britannians' freedom of action, I conceded, but that is very much not the case. Consider the current state of affairs beyond our borders. Kagaya, Cornelia, the Witch of Britannia, is deeply enmeshed in a campaign intended to conquer a territory stretching from the Nile to Anatolia to the Caspian Sea. The campaign to complete the conquest of Malaya is stretching into its second year. Indochina, a secondary theatre, has roared back to life with the annihilation of a Britannian field army, and every single one of the new areas is awash with rebellion. In short, I concluded, Britannia is fighting a multi-front war of global proportions. And I know from personal experience just how even the strongest of empires can crack under the grinding stress of maintaining armies on multiple fronts. More importantly, I know exactly how ruinously expensive it is to fight a war on every front, and how thin the operational margins can be. While Keyuga was the princess-in-waiting of Kyoto House and has become the first empress of Japan in centuries, I learned the art of logistics from a civilization of masters. It wouldn't take a Lurgan to note how many steps it takes to convert raw ore into military materiel, nor to realize that each step represented a vulnerability in the great and hungry machine that is an imperial war apparatus. Moreover, I continued, Emboldened by the thoughtful silence on the other end of the phone line, the Britannians are also trying to maintain a hold over 2 continents worth of people while patrolling the breadth of 2 oceans. All of this, only a few decades after a 3-decade-long succession war between claimants to the throne. So far, the Britannians have managed to exploit their technological prowess to manage these almost impossible achievements, most especially in their rapid development and deployment of the nightmare frame. And that is where their weakness lies. They need the nightmares now. Who can imagine a Britannia without them? But nightmares need saccharidite, lots of it in a constant flow. Without it, new nightmares cannot be constructed, nor can existing nightmares or a dozen other technological wonders be powered. And you, my Empress, are set to control the flow of saccharidite, I said, increasingly certain that I had stumbled onto something that could answer at least one of my private questions. If we play our cards well, their entire empire will be dealt a body blow. I asked you how long we need to hold the hostage earlier, but that was the wrong question, Lady Kaguya. The real question is, how long can the addict, or an empire of addicts, endure without their fix? August 16, 2016 ATB. The school training facility, Gunma Prefecture, 1700. The circle of seated officers and instructors remained silent as Masayoshi, a pale man who Ogi recalled hailed from somewhere up north near Akita, poured out the sake. Masayoshi had been elected by his fellow trainees as the commander of their training cohort, the man charged with maintaining the discipline and health of his fellows throughout the course of their training, mediating between instructors and trainees when necessary and advocating for his cohort's interests if and when conflicts arose. The post of cohort commander had been Ogi's idea, and he was quite proud of it. It wasn't exactly innovative, just a reinterpretation of the class representative concept so familiar from his pre-conquest days as a teacher. What was important to him was that it had been his idea to implement it for the incoming cohorts. It was a small contribution, but it was his contribution as a teacher to the cause. It was another opportunity to resurrect the man he had once been, and Ogi always treasured such chances. Giving the trainees some say in who led them certainly wasn't standard for an official military, but for an organization that operated just as much on force of personality as it did organizational structure. In such situations, I know I would certainly want a say in who I followed, Ogi thought, and glanced wistfully over at his old buddy, his friend since high school. Hell, I guess I had my say, back when this all began. The tray of tiny ceramic cups, barely large enough to contain a mouthful each, went round the circle, and each man or woman present took one, even the non-drinkers. Then, as Masayoshi took his place in the circle, joining his fellow officers on the ring of pillows, Naoto rose to his feet. "Thank you all for coming." The half-Britannian's voice was pitched low and still, almost quiet in the room's thick air. Ogi felt it pass over him like a wave as Naoto glanced around the circle, seemingly catching everybody's eyes with his own in a silent acknowledgement, his easy charisma pulling his audience under his sway. Kozuki Naoto drew their attention as naturally as a lodestone drew fillings, and held it just as firmly. "I will not take much time," Naoto continued, injecting his seriousness with just enough humor to be personable without entering into overfamiliarity. "I know that you all are very busy training our fellow soldiers in the skills our struggle requires. I have heard much about your efforts from Commander Kaname and Major Enoda. Thank you, all of you, for your hard work." Each looked down into their cups. Something about his tone, something about his inflection. It was enough to send anticipation rippling through the stuffy room. Even Ogi couldn't resist leaning in just a bit, eager to hear what he already knew Naoto had to say. "The time has come." A simple announcement. Nobody needed to ask for what. They all knew. "Word has come down to us," Naoto explained, somehow managing that same inexplicable orator's trick again, where every person in attendance felt like he was the only one in the room, from the High Command of the Japan Liberation Front, through Major Enoda, from communications with our allies stretched all across Honshu, and from the mouth of Her Imperial Majesty herself, as relayed to us by Commander Hajime. An empress, crowned again. Ogi felt his heart quicken despite himself. He placed no stock in the old stories of blessed bloodlines descended from the gods, nor did he particularly care for monarchy in general. He was old enough to remember hearing about the last gasps of the emblem of blood in the nightly news, and his professors at university had drawn from the plentiful examples provided by the Britannians of the dangers of hereditary rule in their lessons, usually in the service of supporting the Republic of Japan's own government. And yet, to have a member of the House of Yamato enthroned once again. What lies before us will be neither easy nor painless, Naoto said, relentlessly pressing on, but his grim words somehow did nothing to dent the anticipation Ogi could see on every face in the room, even on the typically blank visage of Major Onoda. Our enemy is technologically superior, backed by the largest empire on the face of the planet, and incomparably ruthless. Many of us will die before Britannia is driven from our shores. Even that did nothing to suppress the quietly mounting enthusiasm. With a pang, Ogi realized that, except for Major Onoda, he and Naoto were the oldest people in the room. Everybody else, the training cadre he and Onoda had assembled from by picking out the best from the previous training cohorts as well as the junior officers representing the cohorts currently passing through the school in this meeting, ranged from their late teens to their mid-20s. When did we become the old men in the room? I tell you this not to frighten you, Naoto continued, but to reassure you, by the time Britannia is forced from our blessed land, you could be dead, your friends could be dead. I could be dead. And so, I say to you all, consider yourselves already dead. Lay down your life now, not in the hopes that you shall one day pick it back up, but certain in the knowledge that your sacrifice will buy our nation the peace and harmony under Her Imperial Majesty's benevolent hand to mend the scars of the last 6 years. Fight now, that your children will know freedom and your grandchildren will live to enjoy the peace we purchase with our blood. Soldiers, not more than a month from now, I shall not ask you to fight, but rather to die. To die, and to drag Britannians and the lackeys of Britannians with you to the afterlife. With the blessings of the gods, we will have our homes again. And so, Ogi thought, freeing himself from the spell of his old friend's words just enough to glance around the circle of awestruck listeners, we mortgage our future in the hope of purchasing a present to amend the evils of the past. These young men and women, these children, are our best and our brightest, the minds and the hearts we will need to build a new Japan. And yet, we call upon them to be the kindling for the blaze. Recriminations later, he told himself firmly, hardening his heart. For you have a part to play in this needful monstrosity still, after all, who better than a teacher to seal the student's sacrifice? On cue, Ogi rose to his feet, his tiny cup of sake lifted high in his outstretched arm. His students eagerly rose up with him, radiant faces turning to follow his motions still bright with the fire Naoto had stoked in their hearts. Swiveling on his heels, his own heart heavy, Ogi guided them in facing the Japanese flag hanging on the wall, the old rising sun. To Japan. Then, turning back to his oldest and best friend, he cheered, to Commander Kozuki and the Kozuki organization. Victory or death. Victory or death. Chorused the young men and women, zealotry burning in their eyes under Onoda's approving glow, the Hierophant overseeing this voluntary burnt offering. Banzai. Half an hour later, Ogi, Naoto, and Onoda reconvened in Ogi's private study, off limits to all but the room's occupants and a chosen few of the training cadre, leaving all of the trainees not currently on sentry duty to enjoy an evening of freedom and carousing as news of the meeting rippled out from the attendees across the cohorts. Behind the closed door, the earlier fervent cheering was entirely absent, although the sake was still very much in attendance. Gentlemen, Onoda Hiro drawled, his normal formality all but absent as a ruddy glow suffused his cheeks. I could not have said this honestly when first we met. His gaze flickered briefly to Naoto's crimson hair, but it has been a pleasure to work with you. After so many solo assignments, I had. He trailed off awkwardly, clearly uncomfortable with that level of emotional honesty even in the depths of his cups. Ever the diplomat, Naoto sprang forwards to relieve the JLF officer from his embarrassment. It has been an honor working with you as well, Hiro, the half-Britannian said with a cheery sincerity that Ogi would have believed, Had he not known from numerous private conversations exactly how Naoto felt about the man who had so grievously insulted Tanya in their first meeting and who had done so much to complicate the process of acquiring material support from the JLF? You've already finished your packing, I take it? No need to hunt down loose socks come the morning, eh? There was very little to pack, Anoda observed, nodding to himself with absurd solemnity. Never own enough to require more than a backpack to carry your life away. Some more? Ogi offered, gesturing with the bottle and allowing the drunken mumblings to pass without comment. Come this time tomorrow, Major Anoda would be hours away, much to Ogi's relief. While he had come to form a strong working relationship with the seasoned commando, he had never warmed to the bastard. His insistence on iron-handed strictness and his preference for corporal discipline were both contrary to Ogi's beliefs as an educator and his understanding of his role in an army comprised solely of volunteers. And, Ogi added, gazing with near unconcealed contempt at the alcohol-befuddled major for a moment before bending over to pour, I will never extend more than the degree of respect absolutely necessary to any man who refuses to extend so much as that bare courtesy to Tanya. Thank you, but no, Anoda declined, not without clear regret. My head will be fat enough in the morning. Drink some water and curse Colonel Kusakabe for the emergency recall, Naoto advised, and it was a mark of how far Anoda had unbent over the course of their working relationship, or perhaps a sign of how drunk the JLF officer currently was, that he smiled at the slight towards his commander. I have plenty of reasons to be unhappy with Colonel Kusakabe, Major Anoda admitted, and Ogi had to scramble to keep the easygoing smile locked on his face as Anoda casually ejected a months-long habit of only mentioning his commander in the most glowing terms. Oh yes, Anoda continued, apparently without noticing the slip, many reasons indeed. I think he fears me, the fool. He snorted, and then hiccuped, swaying slightly on his chair. Naoto and Ogi exchanged a glance over the desk. Major, Naoto began, personable smile almost glowing with friendly interest. We've heard quite a bit about Colonel Kusakabe from you, but honestly, it sounds almost like you and the rest of his officers are the ones really doing the hard work of advancing the day of liberation. I mean, Naoto spread his hands wide, miming shock. We all hear so much about how his 3rd Division is the only active unit of the JLF, but outside of the mountains, we've only ever seen you. Hair. Anoda shook his head, a pleased smirk crinkling cheeks red with drink. Half-breed or not, you're damned smart, Kozuki. Although, no particular intelligence is necessary to see the obvious, I suppose. Why do you think Kusakabe fears me, like I said? It's because he knows he owes me, and the likes of me, all of the credit he's hogged for himself, and he's terrified we'll take it out of his hide. Why do you think I've been assigned one long-term away assignment after another? Ah, well, Naoto feigned embarrassed surprise, scratching the back of his head in a deliberately artless gesture calculated to evoke boyish charm. I figured it was mostly a matter of your training at the Nakano school, not to mention your time in Hanoi. Yes, well, Anoda preened for a moment, that was the on-the-books reasoning. Kusakabe would have been an even bigger fool than he already is to not put my skills to use. But after a certain point. The major shrugged. Well, what does an incompetent braggart of a boss fear more than Gekoko? And you know the saying, the guilty man suspects everybody of his crime? Well. He tapped his nose meaningfully. I will just say that General Kotase had better be keeping an eye open when he sleeps, if he knows what's good for him. He is a very old man, though. He should have retired years ago. Well now, Ogi thought as he casually refilled his and Naoto's sake cups with water, and then unobtrusively filled Anoda's cup with more rice wine. Doesn't that just inspire confidence in our allies? An ambitious bastard or a doddering old man, what a wonderful range of options we are blessed with. Hero. Naoto bent over his desk, resting on his elbows as he met Anoda's bleary eyes with his own clear gaze, and Ogi allowed himself to fade back into the furniture as Naoto worked his charismatic magic again. I deeply appreciate your sincere thoughts on this matter, which is why I would like to be straight with you, just for a moment. Naoto paused just long enough for Onoda to jerkily nod, responding instinctually to the flattery and the subtle authority he was projecting, before continuing. What is Colonel Kusakabe playing at? We are all on the same page here, hero, all preparing for the day of liberation, so why is the Colonel taking away one of our best officers and our finest instructor just as we need your services the most? Please, as a comrade, tell us what is going on. Surely it cannot be this easy, Ogi worried, almost on his seat with the anxiety of the moment as the other two men locked eyes. Bastard or not, Onoda is a trained commando, a skilled operator. Surely he won't succumb to this, even in his currently soused state. I really shouldn't say, Onoda began, for a moment proving Ogi's fears. But, he added almost immediately, the day of liberation is upon us. We have an emperor again. Or at least an empress, which is the next best thing. Besides, he added, somewhat grudgingly, you and your fellow commander, Hajime, have been quite active. Much as I hate to say it, your soldiers are at least as well motivated and perhaps better trained than the bulk of the JLF is now. So in the spirit of comradeship, I will tell you. Half an hour later, Major Onoda had at last tottered off to bed, leaving the office to Ogi and Naoto. Running a finger over the rim of a bottle that tempted him with oblivion, Naoto was the first to speak. It's been a while, Ogi. A beat, and then, since we were last together and alone, I mean. Face to face and all that. Calls from burner phones and coded radio transmissions really aren't the same, Ogi agreed, settling back into the comforting embrace of his office chair to regard his friend. Naoto, he noted, looked so much better than he had when he and Tanya had returned to Tokyo some 4 months ago. The excess decades that had settled on his friend like snow had melted away once he had left the city and had instead begun his new career as the central coordinator and linchpin of the entire Rising Sun movement. Shocking that somehow coordinating relations between multiple insurgent groups, managing the Hidden Village project, and distributing supplies and soldiers to quasi-independent bands ranging from Fukui to Miyagi is somehow less stressful than being the de facto king of a single city. Which, Ogi didn't bother suppressing a grimace, only underlines just how stressed Tanya must be. Competent or not, equal or not, she's still a child. A child in charge of a city. No wonder things have gotten so far out of hand. Well. Ogi sucked at his teeth, mood already ruined. We don't have much time. Shall we get to it? Might as well, Naoto gloomily replied, setting his water glass down and leaning forward, elbows on his knees. His characteristic getting to business pose. So, which catastrophe shall we discuss first, old friend? The Ratlin issue and the general clusterfuck that is the evacuation, all of the reports saying that Tanya is halfway to an outright mental collapse and the fact that she's antagonized a good portion of Shinjuku by declaring herself a dictator? The fact that we're so hideously unprepared for an all-out war against the Britannians for control over the home islands that it isn't remotely funny? Or perhaps how we're suddenly a monarchy again? When you put it like that, Ogi sighed, and rubbed his forehead. How the hell did we even end up like this, Stadtfeld? If you'd told me 2 years ago that I'd be in charge of perhaps the 5th or 6th most powerful resistance organization in Japan, or at least a third of that organization, I'd have thought you'd gotten a head start on the night's drinking without me. If you'd have told me that you were adopting a daughter in that same time frame, Naoto grinned, gloom dissipating for a moment, I'd have laughed in your face. Kaname Ogi, a father? Ha. I think I'd better ignore that for both of our sakes, Ogi grumbled, tamping down on the pang the word evoked. Father. Ino must be laughing herself silly. Then again. Probably not. Let's start with Tanya, Ogi solemnly replied, not bothering to rise to the bait. She's clearly not in a good place, Naoto. Ino's worried about her and so is Nagata. So is everybody on her leadership commission, especially that teacher, Tsuchiya. Everybody but Asahara and that damned Lieutenant Koichi, Naoto muttered darkly, all traces of humor gone. Mr. Asahara, I can understand, he was always a cold fish, and considering how much he loves to watch things explode, Perhaps he's getting some sort of professional pleasure out of watching the fireworks. Koichi, though. The leader of the Kozuki organization shook his head, clearly displeased. I don't like him. He's bad news. Tanya appointed him on the basis of personal loyalty, Ogi commented, not disagreeing with Naoto's impressions. So far, it seems like he has indeed displayed the qualities she desired. Not the ones she needs, though, Naoto shot back. Come on, Ogi, you and I both understand the value of a hatchetman, but don't pretend that you're happy about a clear sociopath-wielding influence over your daughter. It's just you and me here, he added, his tone softening, no need to keep it proper. Well then. Of course I'm not happy that Tanya's found a willing enabler, necessary or otherwise, Ogi replied tersely, but that doesn't mean I'm going to afford myself the luxury of putting all the blame on Lieutenant Koichi. This is our burden, and Tanya's. When Naoto didn't immediately reply, Ogi went on. First, he said, we fucked up with our assignments. Or. Ogi blinked again, trying to sort his jumbled thoughts out. All right, that's a bit much. You and I have both accomplished a great deal, and I am not sure that Tanya could have done as well at establishing friendly relations with other groups as you have, or could have done so well with setting up multiple small towns. Don't praise me too much about that second one, Naoto broke in. We still need to talk about that. And we will, Ogi agreed, but I don't think that task would have suited Tanya's abilities very well. I'll flatter myself in saying that I doubt she would have done as well at running an improvised military academy or coordinating with Major Enoda as I have as well. But, Ogi held up a finger, I think that, with the benefit of hindsight, it has become abundantly clear that agreeing to leave Tanya solely in control of Shinjuku was a bad move on your part. An understandable decision, I'll admit, considering Tanya's fears that the Britannians were onto Callan, and through her, onto you and your mother. But if you had pushed back against her panic and gone to ground in Shinjuku instead of heading out into the countryside with Mrs. Hitomi in tow. Done is done. We left Ino in place, Naoto pointed out, not disagreeing with Ogi. She's done a good job organizing the logistics of feeding an entire city, not to mention keeping the machinery working. The machinery, in this case, meaning things like duty rotas and work assignments, transportation of dry goods from newly arrived shipments to central warehouses and onto distribution hubs. Most importantly, keeping the rat lines providing routes for the evacuating citizens of Shinjuku out into the countryside open and anchored through the strenuous urban-bound first leg of the trip. Still, though, Ogi replied unhappily. Perhaps we should have kept the three of us together in Shinjuku and created a group of sub-commanders to manage everything out here. All the eggs in one basket, Naoto disagreed, shaking his head. Look, no need to beat ourselves up about the past. As for sub-commanders, training people to fill those boots is a problem we have here at a training camp. It'd be even more acute in Shinjuku. Yes, I should have done a better job preparing Tanya for managing a city. Perhaps both of us shouldn't have agreed to place the responsibility for thousands of lives on the back of a 12-year-old girl. Still better than leaving her on the front lines, as she would undoubtedly have preferred, Ogi sighed, and Naoto nodded in unhappy agreement. At least we did that one right. Did we? Naoto's shoulders shuddered in a half-hearted shrug, barely lifting before slumping back down. It seems that the line has come to her, then. Strange how these things happen. But perhaps, considering who she is, perhaps that much was inevitable. The following silence was uneven. Lapsing into pensiveness, Naoto gazed out into the middle distance, perhaps finding himself walking the paths of his faith once again, a refuge Ogi knew his friend increasingly relied upon for support. Ogi, for his part, could hardly find it in himself to wonder. He could think of nothing but how the preservation of even a single young life had somehow become impossible, somewhere along the line. If he couldn't even protect a single child, how could any of them expect to save anything from the calamity soon to come? All right, Ogi roused himself from the moment of troubled melancholy. Where was I? Oh, yes. Second. We trusted Tanya to be an equal member in the leadership of our group. In large part, this was recognizing what had already become self-evident, but that doesn't change the fact that we decided to say that her word carried the same weight ours does. This was not a mistake, at least not a total one, much as I would like to say it was. Without her leadership, we would not be where we are today, nor would we have the unreserved backing of the newly declared imperial house. Do you think it would be easier if we could just say that we made an out-and-out mistake when we agreed to use a child as a soldier? Naoto's question was almost plaintive. If that had been a mistake, it would be easier to, I dunno, to turf her out now? Come back in and reassert control. Oh, if only we could. Hell, what father wouldn't want to save his child from the consequences of her actions? Let alone his actions. We said that she was adult enough to die for the cause, Ogi replied simply. Who are we to say that she isn't adult enough to command others to die for the cause? In that case, Naoto pointed out reasonably, we have to say that one of our comrades is showing signs of increasing unreliability, and that she's in command of the only major city under our control. We also have to pretend that her being a child has nothing to do with this instability. We live in a farcical world, Ogi agreed. After all, Her Imperial Majesty is, what, 2 years older than Tanya? Can't be more than 3, Naoto sighed. All right, enough of this self-flagellation. Tanya's become a dictator, she's barely sleeping, and apparently needs a dedicated minder to even feed herself. And that's not even getting into the real matter concerning her new plan, which I can't help but notice we've both been dancing around without addressing directly. What do we do? What can we do? Ogi asked helplessly. Demand that she leave Shinjuku? Who do we put in her place? You? As for the plan. It could work, Naoto said, turning the idea over. I could probably salvage the notables. At the very least, I could calm the situation down, just in time for the hammer to drop, when we'll need you coordinating with the other groups and leading our own efforts out in the countryside the most, Ogi replied, and tried not to feel bitter about how the task of arguing in favor of his daughter staying in the death trap had somehow fallen to him. Not to mention that. He swallowed. Not to mention that should conducting an actual battle in Shinjuku truly prove necessary, she can almost certainly do the job of conducting the defense at least as well as you or I ever could. And now I feel like a kinslayer and a traitor for saying as much. Damn it all. What are your thoughts about Tanya's plan? Naoto asked, his voice gentle. Call this a move to the topic of the Day of Liberation in general, and for a moment forget who will be in Shinjuku when the ball goes up. What are your thoughts? It is suicidal. Audacious, Ogi said instead, screwing his eyes closed and leaning back into his chair. If we succeed, then the doomed dream of a Japan reborn will no longer be doomed to inevitable failure. Full independence might even be in the cards, or at least independence to the same degree the Republic enjoyed. If we somehow survive all of this to boot, or at least if Tanya does, we will also be ideally placed at the hand of the Empress. High reward, Naoto agreed, nodding along. But equally high risks. No chance the Kozuki organization fades away into the countryside or the slums to fight another day, Ogi concurred. Anybody who knows us will pay the price, and not only Britannians will be wielding the knives. That point had been underlined by the secrecy with which Tanya had passed her plan on to her fellow triumvirs. One plan meant for dissemination among the ranks and for Onoda, and one for their private action. That Onoda had revealed so much about his own leader's intentions and attitude after just a touch of smooth words and smoother liquor showed Tanya's wisdom in playing her cards so close to the vest. We will be choosing a side in a factional war, and neither Kirihara nor Kusakabe strike me as particularly indulgent men. And that's not even getting into the role that Shinjuku will play. Shinjuku, his city. The ghetto he had been herded into at gunpoint, when the Britannians emptied the rest of Tokyo. Where he had educated the children of his apartment building as best as he was capable, sneaking in lessons between his charges' working hours, receiving thin payment from their parents in food and bottled water, occasionally a new shirt. Where he and Naoto had reunited and called their old friends and co-workers together to found an insurgent cell. where he had brought word of a mother's death to a freshly minted orphan, and where he had found a daughter, Shinjuku, squatting almost at the foot of the viceregal governor's gate, the ultimate distraction and, thanks to Tanya, a thicket prepared to entangle the troops that the administration would urgently require elsewhere. Threats to us aside, all of that would happen either way now, wouldn't it? Naoto observed after a half-minute of silence. As for any threats against ourselves and our people, well, they only matter if we win, Ogi finished as Naoto trailed off. I agree. He opened his eyes again and met his best friend's gaze, feeling like absolute scum as he said, "It seems like we're on the same page regarding Her Majesty's plan." Both parts of her plan. We are, Naoto agreed, and Ogi saw his own thoughts played out across his friend's sudden fatigue. I will begin sending word out to the detached units to send their best to rendezvous here. We will be ready to do our part, hopefully everybody else will be ready to do theirs. August 17, 2016 ATB, Ashford Academy, 1230. Reeking news. At 1157 this morning, a fire broke out within St. Edmund the Martyrs on 32nd Street. Though first responders arrived quickly on scene, the building has since become fully engulfed. The Tokyo Fire Brigade has issued a statement that arson is suspected in this case, pending a full investigation. This will be the third church within the Tokyo settlement to suffer an unexplained fire in the last 2 days. Diethard Reed is live on the scene. Diethard, W. With a sigh, Lelouch turned the television off. 3 churches and no results. No, he corrected himself, mouth thinning, no positive results. The general mood of the public is decidedly against whoever is burning down local parish churches, and Clovis has already made a grand statement announcing the diversion of funds from his infantile Clove Island 2 project towards reconstruction. At least the true Anglicans seem pleased. Pleased was a decided understatement. The mood at last night's basement gathering had been outright jubilant. The young people of the hidden church had raised their glasses in toasts to the cleansing flames charring corrupted pulpits, with Sergeant Coffin lifting a bottle of grape juice in solidarity. The handful of children in attendance had laughed and cheered with their parents, eyes fixed on the dancing colors of the old television screen. Standing right alongside those children with noses almost pressed against the screen were, to the surprise of Brother Alexander, the elderly pensioners of the hidden church. Grandmothers with arthritic hands clasped tightly around crucifixes and prayer medallions watched the broadcast of the 2 churches set ablaze yesterday with tight-lipped intensity, the heat of the fire glowing in their eyes. Perhaps not so surprising at all, Lelouch mused, putting the remote to the AV Club's television back into its proper place and packing up the remnants of his hasty lunch. After all, they are old enough to remember a Britannic church far different from its current incarnation. And besides, the front rows at every execution are always packed with young boys and old women. Why should a church burning be any different? But whether or not the flames pleased his parishioners almost didn't matter. They were, after all, already his. They had committed themselves to a new vision of their religion and lacked any other priestly figure to fill his shoes. More important was the tepid and unhappy reaction of those who had not yet joined the ranks of the true Anglicans, and yet more important was the fact, obvious with the benefit of hindsight, that the state church would be in no serious threat until the administration itself was broken. And that means dealing with Clovis. As both the leader of the administration and the source of its legitimacy in the structure of the empire, he represents a keystone. Remove him, and the entire heap will tumble into a sea of personal squabbles. At least until a new governor is appointed, and likely until said new governor shows up with their own private armies of soldiers and bureaucrats. It was easy enough to make the logical connection, to see the smooth path from point A to point B. The practicalities, Lelouch knew, would be more difficult. And that's not even touching on the matter of kinslaying. Grimacing at that, Lelouch sauntered out of the clubroom and made his way through the halls of Ashford Academy, smiling and nodding with recognition as he went, moving almost on autopilot. Biologically speaking, Clovis is mine and Nunnally's half-brother. But, biologically speaking, that man is my father, and that is simply not the case. Indeed, it is only through that man that Clovis is my brother, so if that man is not my father, then Clovis is not my brother. Again, easy to say. Clovis had been a friend, once upon a time. Or, at least, as much of a friend as any prince of Britannia could be with a potential rival. In retrospect, Lelouch found himself wondering how much of Clovis's amiable air and gentle words had been sincere, and how much had been a facade just as pretty as his pedestrian paintings with an equal depth. He had been 7 years Lelouch's senior and a full decade older than Nunnally, and yet he had made time for them, even though Marianne's children were generally despised by the majority of the court. Why? He made time for Alexander as well. Alexander, who was dead. Lips blistered and buried with the skins of the guards who had failed to protect him. Clovis never tried to inquire further into Alexander's death, just as he stood back when that man threw Nunnally and I away like garbage, hurling us to certain death. Can such a man truly be called family? Lelouch had a sneaking suspicion that he knew how Nunnally would answer that question, should he pose it to her. That knowledge did not make him any happier. He worried about his sister. He was also worried about the practicalities of assassinating the viceregal governor of Area 11. Trying to kill him in the middle of his palace is a fool's errand. By now he will be paranoid and defensive. Any abnormality he sees could set him off, but so could some random terror or a stupid mistake. But, once Clovis is out and away from the areas most familiar to him, when he is surrounded by abnormalities, how will he identify a true threat in a sea of menacing swells? Only fear will move Clovis from his throne, Lelouch knew. It was the only thing that had ever truly moved Clovis from his self-indulgent path. Fear for himself, and fear of what that man will do to him if he fails in the duties entrusted to him, will be the goads to drive him forwards, to put him off his balance. So, the blow must come when he is already distracted by a mortal threat. He will want to be close to his armies, to as many armed men loyal to him as possible. If the Japanese rise up, not just in penny packets but in a wholesale popular uprising, that will drive Clovis to utter distraction. He will be beside himself. But when will that uprising come? It has been years since the Republic fell, and months since the last outburst of violence in Niigata and Toyama. This was beyond Lelouch's contacts in the lower classes of Britannian society and the lower ranks of the army. It was beyond Millie's network of gossips in the classrooms and salons of Ashford and of the noble estates surrounding the Tokyo settlement. Fortunately, I know two someones who almost assuredly have contact with the people who would know if and when a general number rebellion would be in the offing. And only one of those people will stab me if I so much as ask. Lelouch's lips twitched up into a half-humoured grin. Well, Millie was quite insistent on our reconnection. It seems that her wish will be granted. The automotive club garage was on the outskirts of Ashford Academy, near one of the service entrances. When Lelouch arrived, he found Rival's Cardimund bent over the open-engine panel of his motorbike, sleeves rolled up past the elbows and hands black with grease. "Have you tried adjusting the sprockets?" Lelouch called out, having absolutely no understanding of or interest in the workings of the machine. Rivals cursed as he dropped something and turned on his heel, no doubt ready to express his irritation with whoever had crept up behind him as he worked on the guts of his splayed open motorcycle. But when Rivals saw who it was that had startled him, his anger abated, replaced by a sort of wary happiness. Happy to see his friend, but clearly suspicious about his motives. With long practice, Lelouch ignored the pang in his chest and smiled just as easily as he had when the two of them skipped class to attend an illicit poker game. "Lelouch." Rivals reached for a rag to wipe his greasy fingers off, moving automatically through the motions, his eyes still fixed on his long-absent friend. "What are you doing here? Millie's gonna be pissed if she finds out you're skipping lunch." "I doubt that," Lelouch snorted, content for a moment to play the familiar and, relatively, relaxing role of friend and student council vice president. It was nostalgic, comfortable, simple. A relic of a different time. Has it been that long? "You know how she gets when she thinks you're not eating enough," Rivals sighed, leaning back against a toolbox. Just you wait, she's gonna pull Nuna in this time too, and then you'll be sorry. Ordinarily, I would agree, Lelouch lightly replied, and looked up from the incomprehensible interior of Rivals's bike. But not this time. After all, his smile hardened as business neared, she is the one who sent me here to have this conversation. Admittedly, he privately noted, it was almost a week ago that she asked me to talk to you, but needs must when the devil drives. She did? Blinking with surprise, Rivals crossed his arms over his chest, either ignoring or not noticing the black smudges they left across his white undershirt. So, what's the press up to this time? Setting herself up as the Madonna of a heretical cult, for one. Conspiracy to commit murder, for another. All to advance a program of sedition and treason. Have you heard anything from that charity you're the paper president for? Lelouch asked, declining to answer his friend's question immediately. I haven't heard you mention it for some time. The Rising Sun Benevolent Association? Rivals shook his head. No, it's kind of alarming, actually. I know that they're still active within Shinjuku, helping out the 11s, but... He shrugged. Nobody tells me anything. I honestly don't even know how they're still operating at all, to be honest. Lelouch nodded understandingly. You were helping them with collecting donations, weren't you? That and providing a noble Britannian name for the paperwork. Mostly that second thing, Rivals corrected, but I also filled out paperwork they needed to renew the passes they needed to get trucks through the gates into the ghetto. Not to mention paperwork necessary to set up those mobile kitchen things. And signing off on expense sheets, sometimes. Aside from that, I didn't do much. Just enough paperwork to get you a spot on a rack. It sounds like you did quite a bit, Lelouch replied, allowing his hand to drift down to the saddle of Rivals' slightly disassembled motorcycle. Are you feeling at all at loose ends, now that it's over? Is it over? The question didn't sound rhetorical in Lelouch's ears. What makes you think things are over, Lelouch? Lelouch paused, weighing the curious inflection his friend and one-time co-conspirator had placed on the word think. It seems we are both taking advantage of this conversation to sniff the other out, Cardimund? So what is it that you are probing for? Truth be told, I have my own doubts about the current calm lasting for very much longer, Lelouch admitted, stepping away from the bike to lean against the wall, pointedly gazing down at his fingernails, as if checking to make sure no speck of grease or motor oil had jumped ship from the machine under repair. Simply put, I'm trying to find a weatherman, of sorts, who could venture a forecast for when the storms might come. Rivals seemed to consider that for a moment, and then lifted a finger, gesturing for patience. Walking over to the corner of the garage, he wheeled an air compressor out into the center of the shop, and, beckoning Lelouch over, flipped the compressor's switch. Immediately the garage was full of the ear-splitting racket of a compressor at work. Standing only feet away, Lelouch had to strain to hear what Rivals was saying. There. The young noble yelled out. Some privacy. Even if this place is bugged, nobody's going to hear anything we say. A commendable degree of paranoia. Seems like Callan really left a mark on him. They did spend quite some time together, back in spring. She was always talking with him during their private lunches. Well done. Lelouch praised, trying to pitch his voice over the din without quite yelling. Have you found any sign that someone's bugging you? Nope. Rivals called back with a cheer Lelouch felt was slightly inappropriate, considering the subject. But hey, if anybody starts, well. His grinning shrug conveyed an entire range of emotions. Anyway, Rivals said, dropping his arms and refocusing, you were saying, Lelouch? Something about the weather? Yes. Lelouch paused again, searching for the correct angle. You are overcomplicating your approach, this is Rivals. You have worked with him in the past. He is motivated by the need to be needed above all else, and by the need to be included. I know you are still in contact with the Rising Sun. It was halfway a lie, as Lelouch knew no such thing, but considering how close Callan had gotten with rivals and how proud he still was of his association with the alleged charity group, Lelouch had no qualms about his bold statement. "I already said that nobody's talking to me anymore," Rivals deflected. "In fact, spare me," Lelouch interrupted over the racket, holding up a hand. "How many underground casinos did we find our way into? How often did you tell me that your bike and your background made you an ideal driver and messenger? You were absolutely correct on that point, Rivals, and I don't think for an instant that a Japanese insurgent organization would let such an asset slip through their fingers. And now it's out in the air. That sound is all of the dice rolling as I cross the Rubicon and mix my metaphors." Rivals had gone pale, as Lelouch had anticipated, but shock soon transitioned to something harder. His friend's jaw set and his grey eyes turned flinty and bleak. "I don't know what you're talking about." The denial was pro forma and flat, empty of inflection or emphasis. "Perhaps you don't," Lelouch allowed, mirroring Rivals' previous shrug. "On the other hand, Callan certainly does. And as she had time before her departure, I am certain that Miss Stadtfeld took steps to ensure that whatever portion of the Rising Sun's web routed through her would remain intact in her absence. And who better to serve as a courier than you, Rivals?" "I won't say anything about any of that," Rivals said, poker-faced like Lelouch had never seen him before. It was impressive how much his friend had grown while Lelouch had looked the other way. "I can't, because I don't know anything about it." "Good," Lelouch nodded respectfully. It was heartening for his own reasons to see that Rivals was taking things seriously. It also meant that his friend actually had some chance of surviving the typhoon that would soon fall on all of their heads. "I have no need to know what Callan told you to do, or even what the Rising Sun is doing," Lelouch said, keeping his voice calm and reasonable above the howling of the pump. "All I need is word of when your people expect the situation to become dire, let's say." "Why do you care about any of that?" Rivals' face was painted in colors of honest confusion, but to Lelouch's jaundiced eye, the sudden emoting was patently false. "Are you planning on heading back to the homeland, Lelouch? It might be safer for you and Nunnally." "Well, at least that secret's still safe, probably." "Not quite," Lelouch said aloud, and spread his arms again in a conciliatory gesture. "In a spirit of quid pro quo, I'll just say that I have of late become involved with a group that has some parallel interests with your friends in the Rising Sun. Not fellow travelers, mind, but we recognize the potential a mass uprising represents. That's why we need to know when we should expect said uprising to come." Silence unbroken save by the hammering compressor filled the garage, the conversation brought to a sudden cleave by the insurmountable presence of the Ask. Towering and arrogant, it sat between the two young men like a brick wall. 1 second ticked past, then another. "Perhaps I overplayed my hand," Lelouch thought, starting to second-guess himself. "Perhaps he will decline to respond. But I doubt that. Despite his recent changes, I know Rivals Cardimund. He will do anything for a friend. You know, I really should have known." At last, Rivals shook his head, smiling, and this time the expression was sincere and unforced. Exhaustion, knowing amusement, and sadness, each in equal measure. All of that apathy. Should have known that was just as much of a mask as the perfect vice president bit. "Not gonna lie. I'm kinda hurt you didn't bring me in, Lulu. I thought we were friends." "Well played, Cardimund," Lelouch thought. "Callan taught you how to cut so well that you don't even need a knife to wound." "This is a relatively new development," Lelouch said conciliatorily, "and well, I would have brought you in, except that your public profile was already too high to be safe. You appeared in the Ashford Gazette, both as a quoted figure with that picture of you as the perfect paternalist scion. You have been mentioned in several of the articles Callan wrote, a decision I'm sure she's kicking herself for now. Most importantly, your name is attached to the Rising Sun on the charter paperwork. If at least one of the intelligence services doesn't already have eyes on you, I'll be shocked." From the way Rivals' mouth set, Lelouch guessed that his friend had thought along much the same lines himself, perhaps on some sleepless night. It had to be done. The statement emerged uninflected but brimming with absolute conviction. It was the only way I could live with myself after what I saw. What did you see? Lelouch asked, with honest curiosity. He had never gotten the full story out of Rivals, and hadn't felt the need to dance with death by asking Callan. Whatever they had seen last Christmas, it had clearly impacted his friend. Millie was right. I should have talked with him more, and actually listened too. Rivals paused, and then slashed his hand through the air, uncharacteristically angry. I don't want to talk about it. So, you didn't want to involve me because I was too high profile, but now you want my help, yeah? Correct, Lelouch agreed, moving on as his friend clearly wished and allowing the matter to drop. In a similar spirit to yourself, I will remain quiet on the further details, but if you could see your way clear towards approaching whatever contact you might happen to retain among the Japanese on my behalf, I would appreciate it greatly. Well, when you put it like that. Rivals grinned, and after a moment, Lelouch grinned back, taken by the wave of nostalgia for afternoons spent together in smoky casinos and for darting trips down the highways of the Tokyo settlement. How could I say no, after all, anything for a friend? Right, Lulu? August 19, 2016 ATB. Itsukushima Island, Hiroshima Settlement. The summer sun shone down upon the island of the gods. Standing next to her father on the slope of Mount Misin, Callan gazed out over the channel where a brigade of Britannian soldiers, most still aboard their transports, had met their watery end. She could almost smell miracles on the breeze. Quite the view, eh, Callie? Alvin, her dad for the moment and not the Baron of New Leicester, chuckled as he raised a pair of lightweight binoculars to eyes just as blue as her own. What a splendid day for a hike. Callan tried and failed not to feel a pleasant warmth in her chest at the sound of her old childhood nickname. Oh, come on. It was the journalist, shrewd but passionate, scolding her this time. Yeah, it's been a great month, whatever. That doesn't make up for years of him not being here. That doesn't make up for him leaving you and Naoto behind in Japan, or for him just swooping back into your life when he remembered he needed an heir. I know that. Callan yelled back at herself, irritated with herself, and with herself. I know he's calling me that because he knows I react to it. I know. Just stop. Let me enjoy it. Dad's home. For now. But, the revolutionary quietly noted, he's still an enemy. Callan shuddered, rubbing her arms. Suddenly, the sun's warmth momentarily chilled as the sea breeze cooled her bare skin uncomfortably. So, Callan, her father said, still looking out across Hiroshima Bay through the binoculars, seemingly without a care in the world. As a pilot in training, what are your thoughts about this battlefield? Quite the monumental location for your profession, eh? A tombstone is a monument, she agreed, gazing out at the steep, heavily forested slopes that stooped to the shore. It was high tide at the moment, but Callan could easily imagine the mud flats that would be exposed when the tide ebbed. She wondered if rusty nightmare fragments could still be seen when the tide went out, bones protruding from the sucking mud. Honestly, Callan continued, turning her head to take in the whole panoramic view of the bay and Osanabe Island, stopping as her eyes found the still blackened stones that marked the remains of the other Japanese battery on Etajima Island, where Japanese soldiers had immolated themselves in a suicidal explosion as the Britannians overran their position. I'm having trouble imagining a worse battlefield for a nightmare force. Especially one made up of those old portmans. Even with naval support. Well, naval artillery can't do much against slopes. Or, apparently, against ground-based artillery. Now, Callie, don't twist the truth just because it spins a good yarn, Alvin admonished, lowering his binoculars to playfully frown at her. Naval artillery is perfectly capable of demolishing land defenses. Provided, of course, that the Commodore in command isn't just some jumped-up prize boob too drunk with power to use the eyes the Lord gave him. Or so long as he doesn't march off down some jungle roads, Callan sniped, immediately jumping on the opportunity to point at Britannian weakness her father had just offered. Over the course of their months together, He had made it clear that he would entertain such comments only in moments like this, when they were alone. And that idiot only did that because an even bigger idiot told him to, and the general was too much of a coward to say no. Seriously, Dad, you're smart, why the hell do you listen to these idiots? Sadly, leadership is a rare quality among the higher forms of the Empire, I must admit, Alvin acknowledged, his moustache twitching up as his lip curled into a wry smile. Indeed, even at the highest forms, common sense is quite uncommon. The Chancellor, as you so aptly pointed out, demands that something be so. He has plans that cannot wait, and so he cannot wait. The order passes down to the governor, who also has plans which cannot come to fruition under the pressure of royal displeasure. And on it goes. But you still serve them. As soon as she uttered the words, Callan wished she could take them back. Not for their content, but because of how sulky they sounded in her own ears. The unspoken "you chose them over me" was not lost on either Stadtfeld. I do, Alvin agreed. I have the unfortunate distinction of serving two masters, Callie, never a wise decision. The Empire is one. My family is the other. Now, he raised a finger, I am sure that you are thinking that ultimately, I will always choose one, and for that you will damn me. Perhaps in that much, you are correct. Alvin's shrug suggested not so much disinterest in her feelings on the matter as an utter confidence that he had chosen his path correctly. I will not try to dissuade you from your path, Callie, but I will ask you to consider this: where else save Britannia would the daughter of a Britannian aristocrat prosper? Her father's smile was kindly. Even his eyes were warm, though they remained as watchful as ever. I'm not the only one serving two masters, honey bun. Just as much as you are a part of Japan, you're a part of the Empire. This twisted thorny bramble of loyalty. It's in our blood, Callie. Ain't no hidin' from it. The wink that accompanied that last comment filled Callan's stomach with gall. Her fists tightened again. I don't believe that, Callan growled, that rot about blood. I've seen enough of it to know that we all bleed red. It's all about our choices. Nothing that matters is hereditary. We make our choices and our choices make us, Alvin agreed, nodding companionably along. But the choices we make reflect the opportunities presented to us. His Imperial Majesty is not incorrect when he states that not all men are created equal. Some are born blind, some lame. Some are born to the nobility and benefit from an opportunity for education. We make our choices, but the choices we can afford to make are informed by our circumstances. Often, the circumstances of our birth. Can you truly say a penniless pauper in a Baltimore slum has the same opportunities as a noble heir raised with a silver spoon stuck between their gums? How can two such children be considered equal, This is going nowhere, the revolutionary sighed with disgust. Arguing in circles is wasted breath. But, the journalist noted, he isn't upset yet. He's eager to talk. And he didn't really answer the last question now, did he? Why do you serve Britannia, Dad? Callan was proud of herself. The question had come out as level as any innocuous comment ever could, with just the right amount of curiosity to pitch the whole matter into the realm of the philosophical. Just as her father had instructed her, when it came to interrogation. Oh, Callie, Alvin chuckled fondly, what else could I serve, save the Empire? Myself as a baron? Small change. Petty. Beneath me. The interests of some faction, aiming to position themselves as the new imperial favorite. Uselessly short-sighted, the emblem of blood proved that much. No, Callie, only the Holy Empire of Britannia is worthy of me. Despite ourselves, we are the greatest power to stride the earth, in this era or any other. What could be a greater goal than the care and preservation of that great behemoth? Retorts teemed on Callan's tongue. After a moment, the journalist chose one for her, pushing aside useless defiance for something more interesting. You mentioned yourself and you mentioned factions, you didn't mention the Emperor. L'état, c'est moi, Alvin quoted, the language of the old enemy flawless on his tongue. For emperors and kings, that is the ideal, a functional unity with the state, where the state's interests are inextricable with the interests of the king. Sadly, we are all only humans, even if the state church sometimes claims otherwise. The ideal is seldom within our reach. That's a fine distinction, Callan noted, her heart suddenly pounding in her ears. What her father, the arch-servant of Britannia and almost certainly a highly placed member of the Directorate of Imperial Security, had just said was tantamount to treason. Was treason, if he truly was of the secret services, as she suspected. Perhaps some things truly do run in the blood? Callan squeezed her fists shut, fighting down the urge to laugh at that manic thought. But what was it he said about Naoto? In Area 11, the Japanese are the least of the Empire's concerns. So, what is the greatest of the Empire's concerns in Area 11, then? Himself, perhaps? What do you do when those two interests diverge? When the Emperor falls short of that ideal? Who are you? I serve two masters, Alvin replied imperturbably. I do whatever I must to advance their interests, according to my own best instincts. I know that you resent my taking you on this trip and preventing you from charging off into danger, chasing after your brother's footsteps. I know that too many among the peers and princes of Britannia mistake service for and to themselves as service to the Empire and bitterly resent being brought to heel. In either case, I am content with my choices, for I know that I am true in my service. Arrogant, Callan muttered. It was the word that best described Alvin when he was like this, when he was the Baron of New Leicester. When he was Dad, affectionate fit better, but this was unquestionably the noble, not the father. And proud as a cat, Alvin agreed with a smiling wink, but consider this, Callan, I saw the emblem of blood with my own eyes. My hands played a small part in bringing it to a close. I saw how the Empire suffered then, for lack of a strong leader. What do you think I see now, when I look to the work of the last decade? Her father's mouth twisted, the amiable smile beneath his bristling moustache souring with a disgust so genuine that Callan could only read it as perfectly sincere. Unsettled areas, quickly conquered but only half digested. Settlements half built, but full of idle hands and unemployed bodies. Our empire, masters of the world, but still unable to master itself. Every faction that mattered was broken and brought to heel, so why now does my empire suffer? And what should a true servant of the Empire do, in the face of this drunken, gluttonous fever? What, pray tell, do you think I am attempting, Callan? In the blood indeed, Callan thought, impressed despite herself as she turned away. And here I was, thinking I was playing a dangerous game infiltrating the ROTC and sparring with Lelouch. Clearly, she had been thinking on too small a scale. Following her father back down the ridgeline trail towards where Errol, her father's sardonic chauffeur, waited with the car, Callan couldn't help but wonder if, buried under all the court politics and parlor tricks, there might be a thing or two worthy of her time her father could teach her after all. August 19, 2016 ATB, EB Field Office, Hiroshima Settlement. It was Alvin Stadtfeld's firm opinion that service was a way of life, and that the only true demonstration of faith came from the fulfillment of one's duty. Those had been the articles that his father, the previous Baron of New Leicester, had carved into his conscience as a young boy growing up on the banks of the mighty Ohio. Our seat is high and proud, though our fief be small and lowly, the old man was fond of saying, the clipped Pendragoner accent he used at court softening into the melodious tones of their native interior homeland. We come from a long line, an old line, of nobility. We once held fief in the lost lands, and when we lost those estates to the vampire of Europe, we were given new lands to hold in trust. Why were we given fresh estates, when so many other ancient families slipped down the rungs from the greater to the lesser nobilities? Because, my boy, we Stadtfelds understood that privilege comes with obligation, and that those obligations run both up and down. Loyalty above all, my boy, and to the Empire above all other allegiances. Even then, Alvin had wondered who his father was trying to convince. Alvin himself had been born in 1956, a year after the birth of Charles I Britannia and 2 years after the commencement of what had even then been called the Emblem of Blood. Imperial unity was already a faded dream by 1972, when the old man's sense of duty at last broke, along with his neck as he hung himself in the yew copse just behind the family chapel. Already recognized by his tutors and his peers as a leader, Alvin had stepped into his father's still cooling shoes without pause or much in the way of feeling. A sign of the times, that despair was an unaffordable luxury and any perception of weakness invited attack by the circling vultures at the Rump Imperial Court. New Leicester was too insignificant of a fief to merit the attentions of any of the aspirants to the teetering imperial throne, but that same insignificance meant that none of the self-proclaimed monarchs would be inclined to offer protection. Besides, for all the old man had lectured on about duty to the empire, the thought of the duty he owed to his family, to his sons and daughters, to Alvin, had clearly fled his mind at some point. Alvin had resolved to never make his father's mistake. He had walked many miles since, in many shoes and under many names, but the two lessons his father had taught him had never left Alvin's mind. Loyalty to the empire. Loyalty to family. One taught in contraveyance to the obvious failings of the time, one taught by the failings of the teacher and the scars his passage had left. To each, Alvin applied his own twist, a refinement upon the lessons his father had passed down that paired nicely with the developments he made to the fief he had inherited. Emperors and empresses came and went, striving to fill the shoes left empty by the ancient Ferdinand van Britannia, whose advancing senility had seen more and more of his authority slip away in the twilight years of his reign. While they fought, Alvin ordered factories built and roads maintained, his castellans churning out munitions even as Alvin served in first the Royal Fusiliers, and then in units whose names and existences were a state secret. Alvin served each sovereign in turn as they seized Pendragon, their predecessors drowning in blood or choking in poison, but always his eyes were fixed upon the realm itself, his own true king. Monarchs came and went in their ostentatious colors, but the institutions that kept the fires burning and the navy guarding the seas against foreign incursion remained. Years dragged on and Alvin matured into subtlety. What was the knife compared to the hand that brandished the blade? Yes, but what use could the hand be if the mind that guided it was held captive? He did not forget his blood. Aunts and uncles, nephews and nieces and cousins twice removed all found choice job offers falling in their laps, unexpected windfalls from unlikely investments paying out. Alvin did not advertise these achievements, nor did he claim credit. Duty was its own reward, at least when it came to family. From the ranks of the commandos, Alvin proceeded further into the dim labyrinth of the security state, where the passage of emperors and archdukes, princes and magnates was almost unremarked. Those men of note were like strider bugs, skimming across the surface of a pond, leaving ripples that never penetrated the cool depths. Down in the depths, quiet wars were waged in whispers and slips of paper blackened with tiny rows of immaculately neat code. The ripples of those wars seldom disturbed the surface of the pond, where the striding insects vied for dominion, but every now and again, something would emerge in a heaving rush, surging through the water like a hungry carp. And one of those striders would disappear forever, forgotten completely. It had been there, down in the cold muck, that Alvin had truly made his bones. Among the carp, bottom feeders all, he had become a pike. Unlike the relentless cynicism of his fellow grey men, Alvin had believed with the purity of a child and the fervency of a prophet. He had believed in Britannia. He had believed in a people who, properly led and properly guided, could face down the entire world in the full expectation of triumph. Sometimes, Alvin thought, it had only been that belief that had kept him sane, kept him himself, as so many of his fellows spiraled into paranoia and into greed. Had hoarded their talent and connections out to one pretender or another, or worse still, to foreigners. Had begun lining their pockets instead of greasing the wheels, had succumbed to despair, like his father, succumbed to wanton lust for power and flesh, or succumbed to arrogance and betrayed the empire itself. When Alvin at last cleaned house, the few ripples that percolated up to the surface did not go entirely unnoticed. An invitation was issued, words and an assurance were exchanged. Alvin had found a different service to call home, a new set of hidden masters to issue the quiet, neatly typed lists of names and sentences. His allegiance had not changed. What was the role of an emperor, save to lead the people? What was the role of an aristocrat, save to guide his people in service to the emperor, and thus, service to themselves? In Japan, Alvin had found love. Kozuki Hitomi was an intelligent and determined rising star in the Ministry of International Trade and Industry, deeply embedded in the Sakuradite concerns of the Kiraharas and the Sumirages but stymied by her low birth, important even in Republican Japan, and especially by her gender. Posing as a factor for a private consortium of importers, Alvin had first cultivated Hitomi as a contact, an agent embedded within the bowels of a nation already on the chopping block a full 2 decades before the first nightmares made landfall on Honshu. Reuben Ashford's insane invention, put to deadly effect in the hands of Marianne the Flash, later Empress Marianne, had seen to that. He had been astonished that his new paramour, freshly seduced into his bed, actually believed in republicanism, in the same way that he believed in Britannia. Alvin had been certain that nobody so thoroughly mistreated by their own could retain such loyalty, that, after all, had been why he always took care to see to the bondsmen and freemen of his own fief, so that the commons would always know who their benefactor was in lean times. But still, Hitomi had believed with sufficient conviction that Alvin had found his own beliefs shifting, ever so slightly, to more closely align with hers. After all, Britannia had managed with only the most nominal of emperors for 44 tortuous years, had it not? Properly guided and properly led, who knew what the Britannian nation could be capable of? Alvin loved Hitomi. He loved her for her wit, for her strength, for the sincerity of her belief. He loved her for the way she had opened his eyes, had given him cause to re-examine himself and the world he would leave to his heirs. Above all else, he loved her for the children she had given him. Nathan, Naoto, had come into the world screaming his lungs out, hands balled into tiny fists as he screamed his healthy outrage. His 2 stillborn siblings that had followed had emerged blue and cold, dead before Alvin could hold them. When Callan entered the world, she had been so small, she had captured his heart along with her mother's, and along with her big brother's. Nathan had stood by Hitomi's hospital bed, at 8 years old enough to be immediately protective of his new little sister. Alvin had let go of his son's hand so his boy could reach out to take Callan's own tiny hand between his own, even as her mother fed the infant her first meal. Alvin had renewed his vow to himself then, as he had when Nathan had been born, that he would never be his father's son. Nothing was ever easy. Since that moment by a hospital bed, Alvin had walked still further, the miles vanishing behind him as he strode in an ever older man's shoes. The conquest, the invasion of Japan, had aged him greatly. He had not been there with his family when it truly mattered, called back to the homeland for duties that could not rest. Always torn between his 2 masters. Kith and kin had conspired against him, demanding that he marry. For years, Alvin had held firm in his denials, truthfully claiming that he was indeed already married and thus could not take the hands of the eligible young bachelorettes introduced to him. When Bishop Warren of Tucson became Archbishop Warren of Rochester and bigamy became the law of the land, pressure had increased. Torn again between 2 masters. Torn by the knowledge that his little girl could not, should not, be expected to hold her own in the blood-soaked lands of Britannia, where the emblem of blood was only the freshest deluge of fratricide to feed a swamp already choked thick with the rotting dead. Knowing that he had no choice in the matter, Alvin had done what he could. Alicia was a shrew, an intolerable presence in both his bed and his life, but she was a useful mask to conceal Callan's heritage. Nathan's, sadly, was too clearly emblazoned across his face to maintain any such deception. Alvin had introduced Alicia to his life and installed her in the manor he ordered built on a plot of land near where the hotel that he and Hitomi had first consummated their love had stood. His money had purchased a polished past for Callan and a place in Ashford Academy under the knowing eye of the father of the nightmare himself, Reuben Ashford. He would, Alvin had decided, give his daughter a soft entrance to Britannian society. The watered-down circles of provincial nobles would give her the skills she would require while he kept the fires in the homeland burning, both in a professional and a private capacity. Nathan, He would give his blessing and the support he would need to carve out a new life for himself in the same shadows Alvin had moved in for the majority of his adult life. Words could not express Alvin's frustration when he had learned just how much Callan and Naoto had proved themselves his and Hitomi's children. Assaults on the local administration in papers too lowly or too niche to worry the censors, yet with exactly the circulation necessary for those who would matter to notice. Involvement with criminal organizations, with obvious shell organizations masquerading as charities, and with outright rebel insurgencies. And that wasn't even touching on Callan's unexpected entrance into the training corps as a nightmare pilot of all possible specialties. Any other aristocratic parent, Alvin was aware, would likely rejoice at that latter development. He could only shake his head at how completely his daughter failed to hide her light under a bushel. Her feeble attempts to conceal her tracks by hacking the Ministry of Justice only underlined just how poorly Alvin had equipped his heiress when it came to the shadow games that came so naturally to him, after his long years of web weaving. When he learned that his son had given his insurgency Hitomi's name, it had been at last a bridge too far. Alvin had taken the first flight he could charter to Area 11, determined to save his children as best as he could from the consequences of their own stupidity. In a way, he supposed he should be proud of them, of how they had apparently taught themselves the basic skills of his profession from first principles. He would have been proud, had they not demonstrated their mother's intelligence with only the meanest fragment of his guile, groping unknowingly forwards like toddlers unaware of the danger posed by a hot stovetop. Or a loaded gun. It had been his efforts to smack at least one of his children's hands away from the danger that had, by a roundabout way, brought him to the newest outpost of the Imperial Bureau of Investigation, and to the office of one Inspector Nelson Garcia. Having met the man, Alvin was very glad he had found a reason to pay the inspector a visit, like recognized like, and Alvin recognized Nelson for the quiet menace he was. Interesting group, these Yokohama scouts of yours, Alvin mused aloud, sipping his tea. Seated next to him, Callan likewise partook with a distinct lack of enthusiasm or appreciation for the delicate blend. While she had improved markedly since their jaunt began, she still resembled a compressed coil to his experienced eye, all but screaming with tension. Nelson, Alvin was sure, was equally aware of his daughter's barely concealed energy. He could only hope that the honorary assumed that the source of her tension was fear of the Bureau, rather than the murderous rage he was certain she harbored against the man arguably responsible for the punitive actions in Yokohama. "Thank you, Baron Alvin," Nelson replied in his almost unaccented voice, each word perfectly shaped on his tongue and coolly respectful to Alvin's ears. There was, after all, no love lost between their services. Or, at least, between Nelson's service and the one he obviously assumed employed Alvin. "I find their enthusiasm and their dedication quite commendable," Nelson continued after Alvin failed to reply immediately. "They are young, but their understanding of their roles within the imperial hierarchy is impeccable, as is their belief that they have something to offer the empire." "Just as you believe," Alvin noted, taking care to inject a certain careless note into his voice. It was an old interrogator's trick, to convey an unspoken disbelief in what the subject had just said without deigning to voice that disbelief aloud. Judging by how the honorary's eyes narrowed, the barb had not been lost on him. "Struck right on that chip you carry on your shoulder, didn't I?" Alvin thought with a certain grim satisfaction. It's the same chip that every honorary with a position above the menial carries. Truth be told, Alvin had little against honoraries. Despite his background, he retained sufficient self-awareness to recognize the staggering level of hypocrisy required to begrudge the potential of his true love's kin while elevating his own half-blooded children to the aristocracy. He most certainly had little to hold against third-generation honorary Britannians, such as Nelson Garcia. While the first and second generations might still harbor memories of previous national identities, by the time the third generation came around very little was holding them back from becoming valuable and doughty servants of the empire. Were Nelson any other dutiful honorary servant of the empire, Alvin would have been content to pat his head at a job well done. Such men were the cogs of a vast machine whose greater components men such as Alvin represented, the machine of the state and its institutions. It was the same reward for service a lord might give a dutiful bondsman. But unlike the rest of the intelligence community in Area 11, inept or compromised as they were, Nelson Garcia posed a threat to Alvin's daughter. Alvin had not known as much before he had seen the way Nelson's eyes had ever so briefly widened when he saw Callan, a hasty reaction suppressed in an eye blink as his daughter entered the inspector's office a pace behind him. The inspector had concealed it well, bending to kiss his daughter's hand in acknowledgement, thankfully without any hint of Latin passion or impropriety, and then focusing his attention wholly on Alvin for the duration of their conversation. But Alvin had known by that traitor shock that Nelson recognized Callan. He had also known that Nelson recognized her not by name, as might be expected of a man who had lightly educated himself on every member of the greater or lesser nobilities in his new area of posting, but by description. Someone had described his little girl to the bureau man under a name besides Callan Stadtfeld, heiress of House Stadtfeld. And that meant that Nelson had to die. Although not until Alvin figured out who was telling tales about his daughter to men from an apparatus of state security. The things a father did for his indiscreet children. Though it is the duty of a parent to clean up after their children's first mistakes, I suppose, he mused, and to make a lesson out of the experience in the hopes of preventing repeat performances. Errol, at least, will be thrilled to dispense with the chauffeur pretense for a while, Alvin reflected with private amusement. Why, to hear him moan, an uninformed listener could be forgiven for thinking I had put the man out to pasture instead of putting him in charge of keeping my daughter's foolish head attached to her shoulders. What, such is the price of good help? And never let it be said that I am so distant from the regiment to forget that it is a soldier's sacred right to endlessly bitch. Indeed, my lord, Nelson replied, dipping his head slightly. I am a humble servant of His Imperial Majesty, as was my father, as will, God willing, my sons. After I am so blessed by children, of course. Of course, Alvin smiled back pleasantly, casually passing all thought of Errol and his multitude of useful little skills to the back of his mind as he met the inspector's eyes. Children are indeed such a blessing. Why, my own daughter has recently found her calling behind the control yoke of a nightmare. Callan, he added indulgently, turning to smile at her, tapping on the side of his teacup in a code he had taught her on the train ride to Hiroshima from Tokyo. Why don't you tell the inspector all about Major Pitt? The code, of course, had been a message to play nicely and to cooperate. Callan needed no further invitation to go off on a wave of invective about the despised Major Pitt, comparing the man against any number of other soldiers to the Major's universal loss. Nelson made all the appropriate encouraging noises and gestures, as well as a few remarks agreeing with Callan's assessment of the unfortunate officer's shortcomings. As his daughter talked, Alvin carefully observed Nelson as he refreshed his teacup, searching for more tells. Sadly, the man had clamped up behind his politely interested facade. Grudgingly, Alvin gave the inspector a point for professionalism. It was enough to give him cause for regret as to what must be done. It was always a shame to waste competent servants of the Empire. This is pointless, he decided. Best to just get what we came for and leave. And once we're out of Hiroshima settlement with a copy of everything the Bureau is willing to reveal about their interrogations of the Yokohama sniper's companion, it will be time to ensure that Inspector Nelson and the rest of the Hiroshima field office meet with an unfortunate fate. Another strider gone from the surface of the pond. Hopefully this one will not leave many ripples. August 21, 2016 ATB. Senatorial Annex, near the Tuileries Palace, Paris, Republic of Francia, European Union. The conversation began, just like most of the conversations that actually mattered, with the mundane banalities. And like oh so many banal conversations, the chance meeting between Maurice Jacquin, legislative aide to Girolamo Ciari, senior senator from the Republic of Piedmont, and Lieutenant Colonel Volodymyr Tetia, second operations officer on the 93rd Armored Division's staff, began near a water cooler in an unpopular hallway in the senatorial annex. Volodya, how are you? Maurice belted out, jovially elbowing the larger man out of the way and deftly sliding his cup under the cooler's spigot. It must have been a fortnight if it's been a day. How's the wife? Last I saw her? Fine. Volodymyr replied, slumping back against the wall next to the cooler and bringing the cup to his lips. How about yours? Still divorced, and God bless me for it. Morris cheerfully replied. Now, nobody can insist that I must take my shoes off before entering my own damned house. Liberation has come, I see, teased Volodymyr. Tremble, the oppressed mass, that freedom has dawned and all that. Would that someone would free me of this damned meeting, Morris groaned, and Volodymyr nodded in glum agreement. I swear to the Blessed Virgin, if Pilit asks one single more question, I'll cram that odious tie of his down his throat myself. The burly Kievan nodded again, this time in fervent agreement. Every meeting, in the staff officer's experience, had a quota of assholes to meet. The presence of Madame du Pilit, who had been blessed with a particularly grating voice, was enough to exceed requirements for a half-dozen meetings. Well, if you're that desperate for relief. Volodymyr began, a conspiratorial smirk broadening on his lips, allow me to bend your ear for a moment, my friend. Oh? Carefully, Morris turned from the cooler to eye the thick-set Kievan. He and the soldier were on friendly terms, but he would hesitate to call the man a friend. But the familiarity hadn't been what set his finely tuned hairs on edge, that had been the peculiar emphasis on the word, friend. A career political operative, Morris knew exactly how important friends could be in the halls of government. Certainly. Morris beamed, and took the big man's elbow. Please, Volodya, just this way. There's a nice little conference room just down this hall, should be empty this time of day. The room was one of a species riddling the senatorial annex, colonizing every hallway intersection with its progeny of bland little rooms just large enough to fit 8 men comfortably around a table, or 10 if they squeezed. It was undecorated save for the apparently requisite bust of the first consul, comfortably roosted in a niche above the presentation screen. Just like every other one of its ilk, the little conference room was thoroughly soundproofed. As soon as Morris closed the door behind himself, the dull office murmur of the annex fell away. Quite an extreme approach to escaping a dull meeting, I'd say, Morris remarked, releasing Volodymyr's arm as he took a seat at the Blondewood conference table. So, out with it. What's happening, Colonel? Near low, came the simple reply. It's all anybody's talking about. What will the Chinese do next? For how long will the Britannians reel? Will the areas rise up? Heavy brows cleaved down in a severe frown as Volodymyr took a chair and immediately leaned forwards, elbows on the table. And most of all, what are we going to do about all of this? The heart of the matter, Morris agreed. That topic, and that question, has certainly gained quite a bit of traction around the tables of every canteen and cafe I frequent. It has also, I do not think it is unwise to say, occupied a great deal of Senator Chari's attention of late as well. Although, of course, not as much as the question as the latest support tranche to the Middle Easterners. Morris shrugged helplessly. Their need is, admittedly, the more pressing concern. Cornelia is in Damascus, after all. Both men looked soberly at one another for a long moment, and then burst out in laughter. Still can't believe they aired that crap. Volodymyr choked out. She took Damascus a month after landing in Muscat. Did Britannia lose all their maps that day? Let it never be said that the Imperial Press Office has a high regard for the intelligence of the average Britannian, Morris grinned. Or indeed, for their geographic knowledge. Volodymyr snorted at that. Probably just know both cities aren't in an area and couldn't care less. Maybe they believe Muscat to be a mere day's leisurely walk from Damascus, instead of trying to march across the entire length of their dear homeland's unreasonably long coastlines under enemy fire. It's, 3,000 kilometers? Longer? Morris mused. I doubt their supply lines would be happy with a single month-long offensive stretching them that far, even should such a monumental leap somehow prove possible. Not that their propagandists likely care about such trifling matters. They are not paid to provide reason, only red meat, Volodymyr said, shrugging philosophically. But, while the Federation's issues of course are important, it is not the topic of the day. No, agreed Morris, near low is. Everybody has an opinion, many of which I have been told a great deal about, but as of yet, what I have not heard is anything approaching consensus. I have heard, Volodymyr began, his words ponderous with artificial neutrality, that the Navy has a plan. A cheap one, which requires minimal commitment of uniformed forces and has a reasonable claim towards advancing Republican values. A triple threat, Morris murmured. Cheap being the most dangerous, of course, but not risking any of our own skin is always an advantage. Good press, he added generously, always helps too, of course. Tell me more. Before I go on, I should say that I am only speaking for myself, Volodymyr clarified. This should in no way be construed as anything beyond that. Got it? Of course Morris nodded, the message was clear. Either Mediterranean Command, which the 93rd Division belonged to, wanted this message slipped into Senator Chari's ear, or perhaps the Grand Armada wanted the same and were using their land-bound cousins as a deniable catspaw. Considering how Senator Chari had recently gone off on an unscripted tirade in public about his ardent commitment to pacifism despite chairing, among other senatorial subcommittees, the Armed Forces Requisitioning Board, Morris could understand the need for deniability. He knew that the senator was polishing his Dove credentials, necessary for any Piedmontese officeholder, and he was relatively certain that Volodymyr and his masters knew the same, but he knew that they couldn't know for certain. Hence the circumlocutions. Just a word between friends, eh? Morris nodded agreeably. It will go no further than me, Volodya, don't worry. Now, he leaned in, out with it. It's about that pocket navy we have been harboring, the colonel began, and of how far any cargo bound to Japan must travel across the open seas. A few destroyers and a pair of submarines could do very little against the island itself, but as a harrying force or commerce raiders. As the two bent their heads together, the first consul looked on through the pouched, heavily lidded eyes still instantly recognizable almost 2 centuries after his death. Brooding and hawkish between his huge nose and his elevated position, Napoleon's face remained enigmatically blank as the plotting continued. Whether or not he would have nodded approvingly at the small consensus the pair achieved, reached at last along with the draft of the message the senator would be allowed to hear, who could possibly say? August 24, 2016 ATB, a village near the Machala Cuenca Road, Area 6, Holy Britannian Empire. Damn them, Sergeant Kururugi growled, glaring angrily at the Roman priest, who shook like a man with the palsy as the EB special constables wrested him from his refuge below the nameless mountain village's tiny chapel. Won't they ever learn to just behave? For all of his fervency, the sergeant's words had come out in a near whisper, a private sigh of exasperation. If Corporal Mary Pines, previously Marisol Pineda, had not been standing at Kururugi's shoulder, she doubted that she would have heard him at all. Seriously doubt it, Sergeant, she said, answering his rhetorical question. Considering the way he jumped slightly, the freshie must not have noticed her approach. Still Academy green, no matter what else he's got going for him. That Sergeant Suzaku Kururugi had something going for him was obvious. Very few first-generation honorary Britannians were allowed to enroll at the Guayaquil school, after all, and even the students from the more established areas were most often significantly older than the young sergeant. Men and women slated to be inspectors or special agents, not freshly made sergeants, were the usual enrollees in the premier EB coin training program. He was immensely talented, very well connected, or both. That someone decided to attach him to a bush patrol already indicates talent, as does the way Lieutenant Bowers listens to him. A practical exam, maybe? Just to make sure his reported talent checks out? Yeah, that could be it. I mean, Mary continued, Cristeros have been waging La Lucha for over a century now and still haven't given up. We've been making good progress, no lie there, but there's still plenty of fools squatting out in the mud. I should know, after all. La Lucha. Sergeant Kururugi repeated, carefully enunciating the L's. The struggle? That's right, Mary agreed, rewarding the man, and he was only just barely that, being 2 years her junior, with a quick smile. That's what they call it. The struggle. The struggle for the old church, the struggle for the old ways, for the old languages, against the guy next door who finally passed the citizenship test and got his honorary status. The struggle has many foes. Which ones were you fighting against? Kururugi asked, blunt as he always was when he forgot to be mindful. Whoever had first taught him to actually use his head well enough to have a decent chance at being an investigator must have struggled mightily to pound those lessons into his thick skull. I mean, he added, catching himself a half-second late back when you were still amongst them, Corporal, who were you? Whoever the big guys said, Mary said, accompanying her smooth reply with another smile, just enough to soften the tension she saw in the sergeant's face. He softened after a moment, relaxing into the conversation. Just like I'd hoped. That's right, Kururugi, you can trust me. I'm not gonna tear out your throat, I'm not doing anything. Just talk to me. Get used to me. I mean, Mary continued, speaking lightly as, across the narrow road from them, the constables not keeping the townsfolk under their wary eyes busied themselves with chaining the priest to a telephone pole. I didn't exactly sign up out of undying faith in St. Joan and the Virgin. It was just that the Cristeros had guns and got free food from everybody. That seemed like a good deal to me. Even though you were betraying Britannia and contributing to the rot within your own community? And there it is, Mary thought, and struggled not to roll her eyes. She liked Kururugi all right. He was handsome, strong, and when the bullets started flying, a capable leader. The sanctimonious bullshit, though, she could do without. As if any of that shit matters. We both joined a gang and his is bigger and stronger. Which is why I'm part of it too now. Come on, Kururugi, she said, purposefully pitching her tone towards jocular familiarity. Buddy to buddy, comrade to comrade. We both know you're smarter than that. When you're some poor farm girl in the ass end of nowhere, when the nearest Britannian presence is the Lord's estate a full 30 miles away and he's only there maybe 2 months out of the year, Britannia's like the horizon. You know it's there, but it's way too far away to really matter. The local constables and the mayor and the Lord's stewards are real, but they're all honoraries, so they're not really better than you, so what's it matter? Seeing the reply already blooming on his lips, Mary quickly added, I know. Rebellion against the Empire, death penalty, so on and so forth. He's hot, but fuck me sideways, Kururugi, get that stick out your ass, she grumbled in the privacy of her mind. Deep breath, keep calm, keep smiling. Yeah, just talk to me, dumbass. Get familiar with me. Real familiar. We're all buddies here, yeah? As if the mention of the wages of rebellion had drawn him forth, one of the constables returned from the Pavi's armored vehicle with a sledgehammer in his hands and a grin on his face. The specific constable, Luis, had once been called Luis. Like Mary, he had once been a Cristero guerrilla, squatting in the bush and defending the Roman Catholic Church from the Britannian heretics. And like Mary, Luis had upon his capture by His Imperial Majesty's forces promptly turned his coat and joined the EB Coin Unit 28, Task Force Crowbar, where he now served as a tracker, scout, and all-around expert on anything Cristero. This Crowbar platoon, 50 special constables spread out across 4 Pavi's armored vehicles, a fuel truck, and a supply truck, included 2 other former Cristeros besides Mary and Luis, and the 4 of them had proven instrumental in hunting down scores of their former comrades. They knew how the guerrillas liked to hide their supplies and their tracks, what words needed to be said to lure the locals into giving them food and a place to sleep, how to find the hidey holes the peasants carved into the foundations of their homes and the walls of their attics, and other places where people and items were commonly concealed by the insurgent cells. All crucial in stamping out of the last sullen embers still glowing in the dark heart of Area 6. Indeed, Mary and Luis, along with Daniel and Sawyer, had been the crowbar to pull the nails out of this tiny village the night before. Dressed in battered jerseys and work pants, festooned with rosaries and brandishing ancient coil guns taken from Cristero corpses, the quartet had slipped into the village with the dusk and had found refuge and a meal without any trouble. That they had also found a priest to bless them when they left the next morning had been an unexpected bonus. Mary herself had pointed out the false wall concealing the priest's secret cellar room that afternoon, when she had returned to the village on the back of a pavise, back in her Britannian uniform. The look on the village headman's face when he recognized her had been far more delicious than the watered-down stew he'd served them the night before. But that's all behind me now, of course, just as whoever you were before you took up the oath is behind you, yeah? Mary smiled as the minor barb sailed home, prompting just the slightest of flinches before Kururugi pushed it down. That he kept his Elevenese name was a sign the sergeant couldn't let go of his past, not entirely. And that was just another point for Mary to pry at. Now, we're both honorary Britannians, and more importantly, both part of the Bureau, yeah? Why, yeah. Sergeant Kururugi agreed, his voice thick, for a moment, with emotion. Both of us are members of the group that will finally bring peace to this land. And to all of the other areas. It will all be over then. Peace at last. Sure, Mary said, and smiled again. If you say so. He was kinda cute when he got all high and mighty, she decided. But he's even cuter when he's all teary-eyed. Kinda like a puppy, only more pathetic. Behind her, the whoosh of air followed by a wet crack and, in turn, a tearing scream harkened the start of the priest's execution. Lining the road and forced to watch by the rifle-toting EB constables and the gunners lounging in the cupolas of the pavises next to their heavy machine guns, the villagers who had not been directly party to the aid and comfort Mary had received last night while in her Cristero costume were forced to watch as the priest was broken to the pole, lacking the traditional cartwheel. Once his procedure was done, Mary knew, those who had been directly involved would all find themselves given a lucky break. They would only be hung for their mistake of backing the wrong horse, instead of subjected to the same hours-long process the old Jesuit had just embarked upon. Considering the vast number of techniques the constables knew for exerting moral pressure on the stubborn and the rebellious, Mary found the hangings boring and uninspired. And also too soft, far too soft. A product of some Britannian officer's policy, not understanding the numbers like Mary, Lewis, and their fellow penatitos did. Not that I'm expecting the local trash to understand that and be grateful or whatever, she thought, shaking her head at it all. Only someone as soft in the skull as Kururugi would expect these fools to learn a single damned thing. But, perhaps the next time a band of Cristeros drops by to ask for food and a blessing, well, they might be surprised by the reception they receive. The image of angry and scared villagers beating the traitors to death, and the shocked faces of the imagined Cristeros betrayed by the little mothers and fathers was enough to coax a smile onto Mary's face. August 26, 2016 ATB, Camp of the Indochina Army, near Yanbai, Area 10/Annam Province, disputed. Field Marshal, Major General Lee reporting, Sir. The Honorable Field Marshal greets Major General Lee, Qin Zuan wryly replied, slowly rising to his feet, careful not to tip over the unreliable camp chair until he was safely standing. He'd grown to hate that damned chair over the last few months, but it had come from the same stock of military-issued camp furnishings that the rest of his army drew from. Consequently, the infernal furnishing had become more than a chair, it was a symbol now, just like his leaky canvas tent and his rickety folding cot. Compared to the might of symbols, his aching joints and sore back were irrelevant. And now that you've reported in, General. Zuan nodded to his aide, who quickly began ushering the various staff officers and guards out of the headquarters tent. Come and welcome your uncle, you damned bin sprout. It is good to see you, honored uncle, Zink murmured in the courtly tones that always drove Zuan insane. Judging by the small, almost imperceptible twitch of his lips, Zink had not forgotten that little fact during his time in the Vermilion Palace. And I will have you know that I have gained a full 3 kilograms since last we spoke. You're still too damned skinny, grumbled Zuan, his broad frame dwarfing his nephew's. He grabbed the extended hand, his hairy paw all but engulfing the Zink's, and pulled the young man in for a one-armed embrace. Still, it's good to see my favorite nephew again. Even under the circumstances, I'm your only nephew, Zink reproved, though he smiled at the old joke. Now, if we were talking illegitimate sons, on the other hand. Let's not, Xuan hastily replied, pulling a face. Besides, there are none, your aunt would kill me. Like any wise commander, I always know when to pull out. The serene smile on his nephew's face grew strained. Rather than intruding further into your personal life, why not discuss why the Eight have sent me here? Zink said, reclaiming his hand from his uncle's grasp. For my own sanity, if nothing else. Though, we may as well just get the nonsense over with just the same. If we must, sighed Xuan, carefully lowering himself back down into the torture implement disguised as a camp chair, and beckoning his nephew to take a seat in the similar chair usually occupied by his aide. Fine, fine. What's the damage? The Council of State, recited Zink in a carefully neutral tone that did not contain an ounce of mockery, commend the honored Field Marshal Qin Xuan on his great victory over the Britannian barbarians and their running dogs. His name is honored across the world as the savior of Indochina and the death of the Duke of New Lancaster. Aha, grunted Xuan, feigning a yawn. How kind of the eunuchs to be so effusive with their praise. There's more, Zink replied grimly, his normal voice briefly returning. In light of your great victory, a grand accomplishment in a lifetime of grand accomplishments, and in light of your advancing age, the young man continued, we're the stewards of this most grateful nation, serving on behalf of the Tianzi, daughter of heaven, see that it would be a fit and august opportunity to receive the notice of your retirement in advance of the celebration we have ordered held across the Federation in your honor. As the previous messenger appears to have gone missing before he had the opportunity to deliver this humble dispatch, concluded Zink, not bothering to conceal his knowing smile as Yuan coughed slightly, we have dispatched your nephew, Major General Li Zink, commander of the Vermilion Guard, so that he may convey news of your honorable retirement directly to the ears of Her Celestial Majesty. Good to hear that the humility so characteristic of the eunuchs remains intact, drawled Xuan, once Zink signaled that his message was complete. At least they deigned to mention Her Celestial Majesty this time. Twice even. The previous envoy, before his unfortunate encounter with Mine, entirely failed to mention her in his dispatch. Clearly an omission on his part, as the Eight surely would never imply that the mastery of the Federation rested in their hands. Certainly not with my voice, growled the hard-eyed Zink, eyes flinty. I would rather swallow my tongue than deliver such a missive. I assume that's why they edited their statement, Xuan said, shrugging indifferently. And I assume they bestowed the honor of conveying that statement to you in the correct belief that I would allow no unfortunate accident to befall my nephew. That, and they always rejoice in cutting the Tianzi away from those true to her, growled Zink. I will have to keep my trip short for that reason, uncle, a snake hunt awaits my attention back in Nanjing. Besides, the young general grimaced, while it is always a pleasure to enjoy your hospitality, uncle, this province never fails to stir up memories. Indeed, Xuan nodded understandingly. I imagine it would. Yes, he decided, I expect it would, nephew. The ghosts of Hanoi yet dog your shadow, if you are anything like me, and your nape still prickles in anticipation for a sword only deferred by celestial intervention. 7 years ago, Britannia had been a typhoon storming across the province of Indochina. The ill-prepared garrisons of Vietnam and Kampuchea, consisting mostly of unenthusiastic conscripts and old veterans and led by overaged junior officers and overconnected senior officers, had drowned in the violent deluge. Shelled from the sea and bombed from the skies, the shell-shocked imperial soldiers and their territorial and prefectural comrades had, for the most part, broken, fleeing headlong for the safety of landlocked Lao Long, far from Britannian Marines and Britannian naval artillery. One of those overconnected officers, a 20-year-old colonel freshly graduated from the Imperial War Academy, had been granted command of the Northern Military District of Vietnam scarcely 2 months before Britannia allowed war to fall from their toga. The post was Yuan's doing, of course, his nephew's talent had been clear to see, but assignment to the posts necessary for a general's rank required patronage. At that time, Xuan had only occasionally met his nephew and knew virtually nothing about his sister's son, beyond rumors of his talent as both a fighter and a thinker. Those rumors hadn't prompted the field marshal to secure a post for Zinc, patriarchal obligation alone had moved his hand. Consequently, Xuan had been just as surprised as everybody else when, instead of fleeing headlong before the Britannians, then Colonel Li Zinc had attacked the Britannian beachhead outside of Haiphong, pushing the surprised Britannian Marines back into the Beibu Gulf. By the time a Britannian relief force pushed north from Namding, Zinc had already slipped the noose, retreating in good order past Haiduong and collecting up refugees and the remnants of splintered units as his brigade marched towards the city of Hanoi. It had been there, amid the pyre that Britannian incendiaries dropped in the tens of tons had made of the city between rivers, that Colonel Li Zinc had made his stand. As Hanoi burned behind him, Zinc had dug into the fork of the Red and Tian Duke rivers, prepared to execute the evil-minded orders issued by panicking men who deemed themselves generals. Those men, all part of the court faction, as most generals appointed to commands near the borders of China itself were in those days, had cared not a whit that the city and the prefecture were lost. They had only known that the general who failed to pull victory from the pit of defeat would be an ideal scapegoat. And only by the whim of a child was my nephew spared from the headsman's sword, grimaced Xuan. And by that whim, the child won the unquestioning loyalty of the most undoubtedly talented officer of the new generation. Arguably, that accidental masterstroke might be the Tianzi's only true proof of holding the mandate of heaven, because surely nothing else indicates as much. That last thought was one that Xuan could never share with his nephew, despite their shared blood and mutual affection. For all that they held together in common, the broad gulf of factional difference yawned widely between them, and Xuan had no more faith that he could ever cross that gulf to reach Xuan than he had that he could reach out to one of the eunuch's henchmen. In his heart of hearts, Xuan knew Zinc loved the Tianzi as his monarch. For all that the young commander of the Vermilion Guard spoke out about the need for the Federation to face the future instead of dwelling on past glories, Xuan knew that any future Zinc envisioned for China and her subject provinces would have a place in its center for the Daughter of Heaven. And while I can respect the Tianzi's chief bodyguard for always placing her interests foremost, thought Field Marshal Qin Xuan, I will not see the Federation's future bound to such anachronisms as child rulers or hereditary monarchy, just as I will extirpate utterly even the image of the imperial eunuchs. Well, Xuan said, slapping his knee as he leaned forwards onto his collapsible desk, now that you've gotten the nonsense from the eunuchs out of the way, how about you tell me what's really being said at court, nephew? A great deal, murmured Zinc, a slight smirk tracing across his lips. Needless to say, while all were united in their surprise at your success, the reactions have been as varied as the fish of the sea. To start, and now Zinc drew himself up, erect and proud, Her Celestial Majesty, the Tianzi, congratulates you and General Hu on your shared victory and exemplary cooperation. She says that she would bid you visit the Vermilion City so she could congratulate you in person, but will refrain from doing so out of the conviction that you are doing far greater service for the Federation where you are, and out of respect for your known distaste for the ceremonies of court. Does she now? Xuan asked, and smiled politely. There were several things that he found interesting about that message, starting with the fact that the Tianzi had extended her respects to General Hu of the Viet Trung, the leader of the Indo-Chinese fighters in the northern regions of Britannian occupation. Neither of the two messages sent by the Eight, as the Council of State were unofficially known, had so much as mentioned the woman's name. That the Tianzi, unlike the eunuchs, realized the advisability of not issuing an order, no matter how cloaked as a suggestion it might be, that would not be followed is of course also of interest as well. Which only proves once again that a 15-year-old child is a better leader than that committee of worthless old men ever could be. And, Xuan noted, that such a small step-up is notable only indicates how easily a proper military leader backed by a cadre of experienced officers could surpass either of them. Please express both my official and my personal gratitude to Her Celestial Majesty, said Xuan, both for sparing me from the obligation to exchange brotherly smiles with Gao Hai and for permitting me to continue my work in relative peace. I will, promised Zinc. On the other hand, the 8 are predictably displeased with your failure to die honorably in battle, and even moreso by the gall you exhibited in triumphing over the foreign invader. They are greatly disturbed by the spontaneous celebrations across the Federation held in honor of your victory. My heart weeps, Xuan dryly replied. Naturally, I will take their feelings into account when planning my next campaign. Of course, I am certain that you shall, Zinc replied with matching sobriety. In the meantime, the eunuch's pets in command of the Laodong militarized zone have expressed the opinion that, as you have achieved so much with your current forces, Uncle, you require no further reinforcements. Of course, grunted Xuan. Hadn't expected anything less from those chicken shits. So, where do they propose sending my reinforcements instead, Malaya, maybe? The northern border with the Europeans, perhaps? No, he said, holding up a quelling hand while raising the fingers of his other hand to his brow, miming deep thought. Let me guess, straight into the ranks of their own banners, where they can squat uselessly in Dalian and Dandorm. Yes, half right, confirmed Zinc, tipping a hand back and forth. Assigned to their command? Yes. Merely cooling their heels in their barracks or working for one of the businesses owned by the eunuchs? Not so much. Oh? Xuan was somewhat taken aback by the answer he'd received. The men who begged at the table of the 8 for favors and indulgences were not, as a whole, given to audacity, or indeed, initiative. All right, spit it out. What scheme are the fools in Laodong cooking up? You might recall, Uncle, Zinc began, speaking slowly, that the remnants of Japan's former government have been enjoying Her Celestial Majesty's hospitality in Beijing for the last 6 years. Almost on the very doorstep of the Laodong militarized zone. You might also recall that the Free Japanese Army established a training base just outside Shenyang last year. No. Xuan was already shaking his head, desperately in his disbelief. They wouldn't be so foolish. Not even the eunuchs would risk so much on a single roll of the dice, not for mere comeuppance. Not when we've already lost all but the nubs of Malaya and Sumatra to the Britannians already, not to mention the bulk of Indochina. Surely nobody would be such a fool to consider an invasion, pardon me, a liberation of Japan. Cao Gofan would, Zinc replied, the corners of his mouth tight with disapproval. With the express backing of the Council of State, no less. They have directed him, in his office as the Commandant of Laodong, to offer up any and all military and logistical support to aid the re-establishment of the Republic of Japan under the leadership of Prime Minister Sawasaki. Damn them all. Xuan slumped slightly, suddenly feeling every one of his 67 years stacked high upon his shoulders. Japan. Area 11. If there's any territory Britannia will defend to their utmost outside of their homeland itself, it's the damned Saccharidite Mountain. And Cao is the one in command of the operation? Lieutenant General Cao, who to the best of my knowledge has never held a field command? That Cao is going to spearhead a surprise invasion unsupported by heavy fleet assets or significant air power? The same, Zinc confirmed, although I don't believe it will be entirely unsupported. If the rumors going around the Vermilion City have any grounding whatsoever, the 8 might just have a man on the inside. August 19, 2016 ATB, JLF Headquarters bunker below Mount Ana, Gifu Prefecture, Area 11. Fuming, Colonel Kusakabe Josui slammed the door to his temporary quarters behind him. Standing in the dark of the unlit room, the colonel's breast heaved as he struggled to master himself. How dare they? How dare they? In his mind's eye, a row of graying faces appeared, each graver than the last. Kotise, the old man still clinging on in his dotage, his unctuous chief of staff, the 3 uniformed fools who dared call themselves divisional commanders, Josui's so-called peers, and most damnably of all, Todo of Miracles, all arrayed in full uniform olive. Behind each of their calmly grim countenances, Josui could just see the mocking smiles. Could hear the snide comments that he knew they exchanged behind his back, just as he mocked them in the presence of his own subordinates. But I've earned that right. I fought. I've struggled. What have they done all this time instead, Squat in their caves, terrified of their own damned shadows. They let their strength molder, their swords rust, all while I was recruiting new soldiers and sharpening my blade. And this is my reward? This humiliation? In his clenched fist, the official copy of his orders crumpled, the ink of the freshly printed characters smearing as Josui trembled with rage. Those characters, he knew, would still be undeniably clear, should he decide to torment himself by rereading the words already seared into his heart. The 3rd Division is to dissolve into company strength units, with a battalion from each regiment set aside as an operational reserve. The new company strength units are to make best speed to Southern Command, where they will prepare to initiate operations in support of local elements throughout the Chugoku region. Your primary objective is to support local Kyoto House-affiliated units in securing control over the Hiroshima settlement. Your secondary objective is to cut off outside contact to the Okayama Army base and to reduce the garrison. It was insulting enough that Josui's role was clearly envisioned as a mere supporter to local elements, whomever that might be. He was a divisional commander, after all. He was an officer with a long and distinguished record of service proving his worth. Why the hell should he play second fiddle to a bunch of peasants with fish guts on their hands and mud on their boots? But the fact that his orders sent him to Chugoku, of all places. They might as well send me clear to Kyushu, or perhaps Okinawa. They're pushing me clear out of Honshu, as far from the capital as possible. Todo must be behind all of this. Of that much, Josui was certain. He's jealous of the glory I could earn, and so he's sending me as far away as possible. How else could I interpret these orders, considering how all of my forces are deployed in fucking Tohoku? Josui had protested, of course, had argued his case before that useless old shit Kotase and the rest of his so-called peers on the general staff, all to no avail. When the new Empress and Lord Taizo arrived, he had argued his case again in their presence. We have complete confidence in Lieutenant General Kotase's strategic acumen, Lord Taizo had said, replying on both of their behalfs. We will not alter his plan without his say-so. All very well and politic, of course, except that only 20 minutes later the damned girl, the Empress, had broken her silence to demand that Todo's Nightmare Corps be detached from the thrust towards Tokyo and attached to her special operation instead. A demand that Kotase, Lord Taizo, and everybody else in attendance except Josui had fallen over themselves to allow. For what reason? Just on the word of a pampered child who had never once led soldiers into battle, much less enjoyed a single thought in her entire life not sourced directly from the crew of old bastards in Kyoto? And I could have overlooked all of that, all of the stupidity, except... Josui's hand spasmed again. Except that she asked for Todo. For Todo, the jumped-up artillery man, and not for the finest the 3rd Division could have offered. Todo. All of the other jeering faces had faded away from Josui's broiling mind, leaving only that hateful, sharp-featured survivor behind. Todo of Miracles, the golden boy, the only one to defeat the Britannians where it counts. Never mind that auxiliaries led by my own man-hero managed to replicate his so-called feat of defeating nightmares without any assistance from our own. Hell, my command did Todo one better. He used artillery and fixed emplacements while the Expendables hero scraped together only used anti-tank tubes. How dare he steal my glory, then? Who gave him that right? Kotase, Josui's inner voice murmured, the old man who has remained relevant solely through my hard work, and has remained in his position solely out of my mercy and sentimentality, only to repay me like this. Kotase, and the girl. Yes, he decided, relaxing his hands, allowing the unacceptable orders to drift unheeded to the floor, the girl is to blame. An empress? Don't make me laugh. I swore my oaths to the Republic of Japan. I never swore to follow an empress, like some Britannian. Months and months ago, a quiet exchange of messages had left Josui in possession of a scrap of paper bearing a name and a phone number. The colonel had memorized both, and then committed the incriminating paper to the flames, wiping the only physical evidence away. As if he was some criminal, some traitor. I'm not the traitor, Josui reassured himself as he crossed the quiet room, retrieving a cell phone that none of his alleged comrades knew about from his baggage. If anything, I'm the only officer of the old RJA in all of the home islands who has remained loyal. Kotase, Todo, and I. We all swore ourselves to the Republic, didn't we? And now they follow an empress. Damn them all, he cursed, tapping the number and lifting the phone to his ear. Once the government in exile is restored, and once I'm the Minister of War, I'll see them all hanged. The phone picked up without a word of greeting, leaving only an expectant silence in Josui's ear. A silence which he was only too eager to fill. "Good afternoon, Prime Minister," Josui said, injecting respect into his voice as he spoke to whom he presumed to be Sawasaki Atsushi, once the chief secretary in the Kururugi cabinet and now, by the legal chain of succession, the rightful head of the Republic of Japan. "I have decided to accept your offer. For the Republic, once and forever." August 26, 2016 ATB, Tokyo Settlement, Area 11. Over the course of his life, the agent had seen a great deal that argued against the inherent goodness of mankind so often evoked by the European ideologues. Over the course of his time in the service of the tyrant and the Directorate, the agent had blackmailed, bribed, and stolen. He had betrayed, murdered, and tortured. He had coerced confessions, compelled obedience, even carefully led children to convict their parents and husbands their wives with the strategic application of information and cruelty. For all of that, he had witnessed much worse meted out by low men for petty reasons, or indeed, no reason at all. And while many of those low men had been commoners, honorary Britannians, or numbers, the meanest had all come from the ranks of the finest Britannia had on offer, from the three nobilities and of course, from the royalty. Unlike many of his fellow travelers, it had been this increasing cynicism about the human condition rather than an optimistic view of the common man that had guided his path towards level ground. Meanness of spirit was not the sole province of the aristocracy of blood or of coin, he had reasoned, but those with the least fetters imposed by society or circumstance had the greatest opportunity to indulge every trifling cruelty. Binding the hands of all to reduce the damage any one man could inflict upon those around him, he had decided, was the only rational choice. All of which was to say that the agent was not easily fazed. The contents of the drive he had just finished reviewing, however, had nonetheless managed to accomplish just that. The important thing, the agent told himself as he carefully sipped at his soothing tea, stared out his window, and tried very hard to not throw up, is to look past the details to see the larger picture instead. That much was obvious, a no-brainer. Easily said, but harder to accomplish when the details were videos of a woman still somehow alive despite. The agent's stomach lurched. The real question, he considered, eyes pressed tight as he took deep, soothing breaths, is what his ineptitude is trying to accomplish with all of that nonsense. The man is a petty, vindictive bully, yes, and one utterly lacking in any awareness of the pain felt by his fellow men. But to the best of my knowledge, for all of his faults, Clovis is no Luciano Bradley, no unrepentant sadist. Which means that a reason exists for the torture, beyond torture for its own sake. The data drive had come to the agent's hands through a chain of other agents, fellows in the conspiracy of equals, but had its utmost source in an operative that he and his society brothers had carefully inserted into the only environmental systems maintenance service with security clearances in the area of the concealed medical facility. During a standard maintenance visit, said operative had slipped keyloggers and rootkits into a number of the facility's computers. When the air conditioning had mysteriously failed a few days later, the same operative had all the keys and passwords required to access the office of one of the physicians involved, as well as the woman's office computer and laptop. When the operative had left the facility, 2 specialized jump drives loaded with clones of the doctor's systems had left with him, tucked away in a defective sensor in a bin of other replacement parts for the central heating system. Now, it was up to the agent to try to make sense of the contents of those drives. Much of the information, particularly the dryly written medical reports, was easily understandable, at least from a technical standpoint. All of the reports discussed procedures conducted on a single subject, or components of that subject, and most focused on an unnatural healing factor displayed by the subject. Considering all that the girl had endured, the agent was forced to concede that there had to be something to her mysterious regenerative properties. Unless, of course, the doctors had somehow failed to notice that their subject had been replaced multiple times, or that the doctors had decided to refer to all of their subjects as if they were the same person. To his mild surprise, the agent found the prospect of perfect regeneration, inexplicable though it was, less difficult to believe than the idea that researchers and physicians of the quality employed by this mysterious project would willfully butcher their reporting standards so egregiously. So, Clovis discovers a woman who can regenerate perfectly through unknown means. An impossibility, but the agent took another deep breath and set to work preparing another cup of tea. But the videos prove that the impossibility is, in fact, a simple fact. So, a secret project is commissioned to examine this subject. The project is entrusted to General Bartley and is funded via a slush fund without any connections to either the Ministry of Science and Technology or the Ministry of Health. Why the secrecy? Why was this project kept secret from the Emperor? Did Clovis want to ensure he got full credit when he brought his findings to the Emperor? Perhaps, but that's not enough to evoke the fear I saw in his eyes back in his chambers, when we were discussing the financial indiscretions of the late Lazaro Pulsed. And the agent returned to his seat, steaming teacup cradled in his fingers, unheeding of the uncomfortable heat radiating through the china. What is Geass? The rest of the various mystical nonsense is easily understood. The Grail is the girl, clearly, the source of immortality, for a start, but the mentions of Geass, always capitalized and never explained, make no sense. A geass is an obligation or a quest, typically imposed by fate and always inescapable, but how that factors into medical research is impossible to determine. We have, the agent scowled, insufficient information, even with one of the physician's own papers. Everything the doctor knew came from interactions with and experiments conducted upon this singular unnatural test subject, the girl. Which means that there is only one rational course of action. To find out what it is that Clovis is so deeply worried about, I must ask the girl myself. His stomach lurched, the thought of the task he had set before himself, his very own geass, almost sufficient to undo all that the tea had accomplished. Oh, I always did like to set such attainable goals. What joy! August 29, 2016 ATB, Shinjuku Ghetto, Tokyo Settlement, Area 11. And the status reports for Nisha Shinjuku West, sir, the clerk announced, brandishing a small stack of papers. Fortunately, nothing seems to have gone wrong in the last few days. Supervisor Kita reports that his supply of thermal blankets is getting low, though, and requests we send more over. He's not satisfied with the level of thermal baffling in the new nests. What does he have to be dissatisfied about? Asahara Hayashi grunted, accepting the proffered reports and leafing quickly through the pages. Would Supervisor Kita happen to have access to a Sutherland fact sphere for us to test our concealment? No? Thought not. I'll just mark that request down as denied, murmured the clerk, nodding as he jotted down a note. Anything else? No, Hayashi said after a momentary pause, deciding not to comment on the apparent grade school level of literacy the supervisor's report demonstrated. It really wasn't all that much worse than the writing exhibited in most of the other reports, and besides, Hayashi hadn't expected much from the bulk of his conscripted workforce. Standards, he thought, shaking his head internally, truly are falling everywhere. At least the special sections have a few functional brains in their ranks. So long as those standards don't fall, I suppose I'll just have to keep muddling on. The special sections, as Hayashi had privately termed them, were the teams of former technicians, plumbers, chemists, and electricians the old engineer had scraped together for the purposes of bomb construction and installation. Using the authority that his post on the leadership commission granted him as a flail, Hayashi had threshed the teeming crowds of Shinjuku for those with quick minds, deft hands, and a keen understanding of the importance of following directions. It had only been with the assistance of this corps of skilled helpers that Hayashi had managed to stay almost abreast of the ridiculous demands imposed upon him by that radiant pillar of stability, Commander Hajime. TCH. No, that will be all, Morimoto, Hayashi decided, waving the clerk away. The man had been a wonderful find, a former analyst from some ministry back in the old government who had eked out a living through the hard years. He had the technical knowledge necessary to understand the contents of the reports, the judgment to know what required Hayashi's attention and what could be handed off to Inno's administrators without concern, and sufficient initiative to not require micromanagement. Without Morimoto, Hayashi knew, he would have struggled mightily to remain on top of his job. Well, more than I already am, Hayashi admitted. The difference, I suppose, is the margin between merely treading water and actively drowning. That such a quality aid had fallen into his lap was a marvelous coincidence, and so of course Hayashi distrusted the man. He had vetted Morimoto thoroughly before offering him a position in his branch of the Kozuki organization, though, and had continued his surveillance through Morimoto's first few weeks on the job. Despite finding no reason for concern, Hayashi kept a close eye on his secretary's activities. Past a certain point, paranoia became a way of life. As Morimoto made his unobtrusive way out of the office, Hayashi's hand crept down to the abbreviated remains of his left leg and gingerly rubbed at the stump. It always ached. It ached in the cold, in the heat, during dry spells and during the rain. It was all the same, the ruins of his left leg always hurt. The greatest injury of my life, and all because some bastard Brit was insufficiently mindful of how thin the walls are in Shinjuku. After everything I've done, all the risks I have taken, only a stray bullet has posed a real menace to my skin. The thought brought a grudging smile to Hayashi's lips. You had, after all, to laugh about such things. The alternative, killing it all away with the bottle and the pill, had proven far too alluring in the past. Besides, he was on the clock now. At long last, thought Hayashi, allowing his weary eyes to rest, just for a moment, I'm finally in a place where I can do real good. After so long spent collating reports from scraps and mending small appliances to earn my supper. Finally, the gears have begun to turn in earnest. Assuming, of course, that recent developments don't cock everything up. The thought of recent developments, of how, still unknown to most of his countrymen, a monarch had once again been raised up among them, was enough to twist Hayashi's neutral expression. As a young student studying at the Polytech Marseille, Hayashi had drunk deeply from the wellsprings of the republican values that the Europeans had exported at bayonet point to his countrymen a generation before. He had devoured Voltaire and Rousseau first, of course, one had to respect the classics, before moving on to Lafayette and Mirabeau. That had been as far as the confines of the university library allowed him to venture on his journey of political and philosophical discovery. Ever plagued by his curiosity and increasingly disappointed by how short the republic of his homeland had fallen from the high ideals of the great philosophers, the young Hayashi had not been content to limit himself to the contents of the university stacks. Carried along on tides of heady intellectualism and a sense of wonder that was as close as the lifelong atheist had come to true veneration, Hayashi had dived deeper, and had found his way, groping in the dark, to Marat, to Danton, to Babeuf, and ultimately, to Robespierre. To the writings of men who were still, to that day, proscribed by the Union whose first seeds they had sown. It had been his interest in the radical ideals that the first consul had buried below the flagstones of his third Rome that had drawn Hayashi into the orbit of the Direction de la Surveillance du Territoire, the Directorate of Territorial Security. With the benefit of retrospect, Hayashi supposed that he had been under surveillance for some time before the agents of the Cabinet Noir came for him. Under interrogation, his reading list had proven to have been well known to them, with unsmiling agents asking specific questions about when and from whom he had acquired certain volumes. When Hayashi attempted to claim ignorance of any such books, the agents of the Directorate had thrown his very own copies down onto the steel table before him, freshly retrieved from the secret library he had concealed in the fire hose cabinet of his dormitory's boiler room. Fortunately, the security agents had picked him up the day after his graduation, and so after things had shaken out, Hayashi had rather stridently been returned home with an entirely legitimate degree from the Polytech in his luggage. That degree had opened many doors for the newly minted mining engineer. European universities, particularly those back in the Metropole Union states of Western and Central Europe, enjoyed an enviable reputation in the Republic of Japan, and Hayashi's diploma was enough to overcome his lack of the family connections usually required for placement in choice ministries or companies. Despite his thoroughly bourgeois background, Hayashi had quietly slipped into the preserve of the scions of the unofficial aristocracy that still controlled the so-called republic of his home. 3 decades of solid, unremarkable employment passed. Hayashi had quietly moved from company to company, keeping his head down and his eyes open for the first decade, long enough to build a reputation and learn the industry. From there, with a firm foundation under his feet, Hayashi accepted a series of positions of escalating responsibility, accepting posts at a variety of companies that provided secondary services and support for the Sakuradite Zaibatsus. Somewhere along the way, the young man with lowly origins and a European education had attracted the eyes of his alleged superiors. In those days, the work had all been industrial espionage and the collection of blackmail material, bread and butter work. A small house of provincial stock had been his first employer, its master eager for an edge in an upcoming contract negotiation. Good work had brought more work, and so Hayashi had found more work as a pair of hands, a straying eye. Not forgetting his day job, Hayashi had worked hard at his drafting bench as well, eager to prove himself as an engineer as well as a sneak. Ultimately, he had contributed significantly to several new Sakuradite extraction techniques. The raw ore was notorious for its variety, and for the challenging composition of various seams. Using these small victories, he had worked tirelessly to expand his knowledge and enhance his reputation, exploiting every edge to advance another rung. He had kept his eyes wide open, and it had been that sustained attention that had ultimately yielded enough material for Hayashi to assemble a portfolio. That portfolio, delivered to Lord Tosei, head of the noble house of Munakata, had served as Hayashi's introduction to true spycraft. When the conquest had come, all of that nonsense had fallen by the wayside in the scramble for survival. Far from unaccustomed to personal danger by this point, Hayashi had remained in his Shinjuku apartment as missiles streaked across the sky and improbable robots stormed the streets outside. By the time the dust had settled and the new Britannian administration was established, Hayashi had already made a name for himself among the crowds of refugees shoved into Shinjuku by the victorious soldiers as an indispensable mender of machines. That reputation had seen him safely through the horrors of the first year, when the dead rotted where they lay, unburied and unburned. When the cholera came, Hayashi had repaired water filters and stills, hot plates and stoves, as everybody fought to clean whatever water could be found. When hordes of fleas infested the packed slum, Hayashi had rigged crude washing machines to drown the tiny biting bastards where they nested in clothes, and had even briefly worked as a barber, shaving heads. From his neighbors, Hayashi had accepted payment in food and in protection. From Lord Tosei, and then from Lord Taiso, though they paid through the nose, Hayashi snorted to himself. They probably expected no less, all things considered. Especially Kirihara, considering his recruitment pitch. You always knew what was going on back then, Asahara. Surely your eyes haven't clouded over the years you've spent eating dirt under the Britannians' feet? Not at all, Lord Taiso, not at all. But you failed to ask why it was that one such as I would be content to squat in Shinjuku, eating dirt. You never wondered why that was, and that is because you were Britannian where it counted long before the Empire ever set foot on our soil. That your rebellion began by installing an empress to reign over us all only proves the point. Aching, Hayashi pulled himself to his foot and, reaching out behind him without bothering to turn his head, scooped up his crutches. The cushioned caps went under his armpits, the sealed envelope went under his shirt, and the bribe money went into his pocket. As he locked his office door behind himself, Hayashi heard the patter of feet, and turned just in time to see Morimoto turn down the hall, a militiaman with a blue sash draped over his shoulder beside him. The old fear returned, still spine-tinging for all that its edges had been worn smooth with the passage of months and years. The fear of being found out, the perpetual terror of the intelligencer and the spy, for as long as Hayashi had worked for the 6 houses, had agreed to serve the outwardly traitorous honorary elite from the heart of number Shinjuku, he had been a subject to that fear. Even now, a trusted leader and advisor here, in this tiny state in embryo, one of perhaps a handful of truly irreplaceable individuals in this city-wide crucible, the internal affairs man bearing down on him inspired a raw spike of terror in the engineer's bowels. Hayashi pushed that fear down ruthlessly, deliberately arrogant smile already on his face. Men in organizations such as the IAF, in Hayashi's experience, were very sensitive to the trepidation they inspired, they fed off it. Even though the force had merely been a band of picked leg-breakers notable only for their loyalty to Commander Hajime and Lieutenant Koichi a few months ago, when their remit was established, Hayashi had no doubt that they had already come fully into their inheritance as an internal security organization. Director Asahara? The internal affairs soldier asked, and without waiting lifted his fist to his chest in salute. Commander Hajime's compliments. She's calling an emergency meeting of the Leadership Commission. Ah, so it isn't the wall or the scaffold for me quite yet, Hayashi supposed, relaxing slightly as the personal terror was replaced by a more general sense of existential dread. On the other hand, the list of occasions that could prompt Hajime, even in her current state, to call an emergency meeting is as short as it is dire. It must be time, then. Has she? Hayashi coolly replied, unmoved by the plea for urgency. At this later juncture, when the shape of things to come in the next month was so clear to any with eyes to see, haste was unreasonable. More to the point, he would be damned if he would allow himself to be rushed by some young fool in a sash. Well, I will make my way over to headquarters presently. Commander Hajime thought you would say that, the soldier replied, still saluting, and wanted you to know that the Leadership Commission won't convene for another hour still. Oh? Hayashi raised an eyebrow at that, impressed despite himself. How courteous of her to provide early warning. Did she attach a threat regarding what tardiness would entail? No, sir. She's come so far. The musing was almost paternal, almost fond. At least compared to our first meeting, when she paid in drugs and threatened to shoot my other leg, at least. Finally, she has mastered basic subtlety. Such a pity no such development occurred before she reduced even the Thermidorian so-called chamber to an outright state of leadership by Fiat, the consul of her own tiny empire. Splendid, Hayashi drawled. In that case, soldier, consider your message delivered. Sir? Morimoto asked as the slap of the IAF grunt's old, but yet unhold, sneakers descended down the stairway to street level. You don't seem surprised by this emergency meeting. That isn't a question, Hayashi evaded, making his own much slower progress down towards the door. But no, I'm not. After all, he thought, grimacing, nothing comes from the hands of a king without a price, and I've trafficked enough material into Shinjuku on the 6 houses' behalf to know their catalogue, all of the components my special sections needed for the ordnance, the food that kept the city alive, all of the new crew-served machine guns, anti-armor, and anti-air missiles, even the asphalt patching the roads and concealing the mines. We have enjoyed a great deal of credit, and now our Empress has called in her marker. What will you do, sir? 2 stairs down the flight, Hayashi paused, taken aback by the unusually frank question. Turning to look back, he saw Morimoto still in the hallway, his aide's gaze fixed squarely upon him. Cool, implacable, and waiting for his answer. Past a certain point, paranoia becomes a lifestyle. I knew you were too good to be true, Morimoto. The only question now is who. What I have always done, Hayashi grunted, turning his back on his secretary as he continued the painful descent down the stairs. I will serve the people, and I will serve virtue. And still, near Lo's waves rippled on.